In the silence of the desert night, beneath a sky scattered with silver stars, the Nile flowed like a dark ribbon of eternity. Its waters gleamed faintly under the moonlight, carrying the whispers of centuries. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not just a river, it was life itself. The breath of the gods, the fragile line of green that cut through the endless sands. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been nothing but a wasteland of dunes. With it, civilization bloomed like a lotus opening its petals at dawn. For as long as memory reached, the people of the Nile Valley had looked upon the river with awe and reverence. Its annual flood was both miracle and mystery. Each year, as the summer sun burned relentlessly, the river would rise, swelling with waters from faraway rains in lands unseen. To peasants and kings alike, it seemed as though the river was answering the prayers of the people, bringing renewal just as life seemed at its most fragile. The peasants who lived along its banks depended entirely on this rhythm. They rose before the sun, walking barefoot to the river's edge, their rough linen garments clinging loosely to their skin, already damp with the morning's humidity. The fields stretched out beyond them, waiting brown, cracked earth that only the Nile's gift could awaken. They knew the pattern by heart, the low waters of planting, the swelling flood of nourishment, and finally the receding river that left behind dark, fertile soil richer than any treasure in a king's tomb. When the first hints of the flood appeared, villagers would gather at the water's edge, their eyes scanning the surface for signs. Was it rising early? Was it late? Was it strong enough to feed the crops? Or would it be too fierce, sweeping away homes and fields with equal cruelty? Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers to Hapi, the god of the flood, begging him to show mercy. The priests would perform rituals at temples, their chants echoing through stone halls, smoke from incense curling upward like offerings of hope. The Nile was a giver, but it was also a taker. A year of low flood meant famine, cracked lips, empty bowls, fields barren of grain. A year of high flood meant destruction, drowned villages, rotting harvests, and despair carried on the current. And so the people lived in constant dialogue with their river, loving it, fearing it, worshipping it. The river at dawn as the sun rose over the horizon, turning the desert sands into sheets of gold. The river revealed its true splendor. Fishermen pushed their reed boats into the waters, their nets coiled neatly at their feet. With simple paddles, they moved silently across the glassy surface, eyes sharp for the faintest ripple. Fish were not just food, they were survival. Protein in a land where grain and vegetables dominated the diet. Children often accompanied their fathers, laughing as they leaned over the edge, hands skimming the water. For them, the Nile was both playground and teacher. They learned early to respect its currents, to watch for crocodiles lurking near the reeds, to understand the ways of the fish that darted beneath its surface. A boy's first successful catch was celebrated, not just as a moment of pride, but as a step toward becoming a provider. Meanwhile, women gathered at the riverbanks with clay jars balanced gracefully on their heads. Their conversations mingled with the songs of birds and the splash of water. They knew the river's moods, when it was safe, when it was dangerous, when its surface carried omens. They spoke of husbands working in fields, of children growing too quickly, of neighbors who had angered the gods, and always, their arms carried the Nile's lifeblood back to their homes. Drop by drop, jar by jar, fields of life beyond the river's edge. The miracle of survival unfolded each season. Farmers, bent beneath the sun, scattered seeds by hand, trusting the river's soil to embrace them. Wheat and barley grew in neat rows, while flax provided fibers for clothing and ropes. Date palms swayed gently, their fruits offering sweetness amid hardship. Irrigation was both art and necessity. Canals, hand-dug with wooden tools, channeled water from the Nile into the fields, Shadoo's simple yet ingenious devices of counterbalanced. Poles and buckets rose like silhouettes against the sky as farmers lifted water tirelessly from the river. It was back-breaking work, the rhythm of survival itself. To these farmers, the Nile was not abstract. It was a constant presence in their hands, their backs, their lungs. Every stalk of grain that rose from the soil was a conversation with the river, a plea answered, a dream made tangible. And yet, even in abundance, they knew hunger lurked just beyond the horizon. Too many children, too little harvest, or one cruel year of flood could tip the balance from survival to despair. The river, as sacred the Nile, was not only a source of food and water, it was a bridge between the human and the divine. To the Egyptians, the river carried sacred energy. They saw in its cycle the rhythm of birth, life, death, and rebirth. Its rising waters were like a heartbeat, pulsing with divine will. Temples along its banks were built not just as places of worship, but as guardians of this sacred lifeline. Priests kept careful records of the floods, measuring water levels with Nilometer stone staircases cut into the river's edge, marked with lines that told of abundance or scarcity. These measurements were not just numbers, they were prophecies, warnings, promises. Every offering made to the gods, every ritual performed at the temple, was in some way connected to the river. A loaf of bread, a jug of beer, a basket of figs, all were gifts from the Nile, returned to the divine in gratitude. The pharaoh himself was seen as the keeper of balance, his power tied to the river's flow. If the floods failed, whispers spread. Had the king angered the gods? Was his rule losing favor in the eyes of the heavens? Whispers of survival at night, when the desert winds cooled the air and stars glittered like scattered jewels. Families sat together under reed roofs. The smell of cooked lentils or barley bread lingered in the air, thin but comforting. Elders told stories of past floods, years of plenty, years of famine. They reminded the children that survival was never guaranteed, but always earned through patience, prayer, and unity. The Nile, they said, had a spirit. Sometimes it was kind, sometimes it was wrathful. It had seen empires rise and fall, and it would continue long after they were gone. The river was eternal. People were but travelers along its banks. Children listened, eyes wide, imagining the river as a living being that breathed in floods and exhaled in droughts. Some dreamed of becoming fishermen, others farmers, others priests who could read the river's messages. All knew one truth: their lives were threads woven into the current of the Nile. The river, and time to live by the Nile was to live by its clock. Unlike the shifting desert winds or the harsh unpredictability of the sun, the river had a rhythm, steady, sacred, and trusted. Generations passed this knowledge like an heirloom. The river would rise, it would fall, and between those cycles, life would carve out its fragile existence. The Egyptians did not measure time as we do, by months and hours. Their calendar was born from the Nile. The year was divided into 3 sacred seasons: Akit, the season of the flood; Pare, the season of growth; Shemu, the season of harvest. Closing parenthesis. Every child learned these names before they could even recite prayers. Each season was not just a span of days, but a state of survival. The flood meant abundance if it came just right. The growth meant labor, sweat, and patience. The harvest meant relief, songs, and offerings. When the first waters rose, peasants looked to the horizon, their eyes searching the river's surface for floating reeds or strange fish that traveled with the currents. These were signs, whispers of what the flood might bring. Women sang soft songs to their children, reminding them that the gods were watching, that patience was a form of prayer. The Nile and the Pharaoh. Single man's power was tied more closely to the river than the pharaoh's. To his people, he was not only king but a divine bridge between gods and humans. His image was carved on temple walls, arms lifted to the heavens as if commanding the waters themselves. When the river rose generously, his name was praised. Processions wound through the streets, villagers scattering flowers, musicians playing flutes and drums. The pharaoh has pleased the gods, the people said. He has ensured our survival. But when the river failed, when the flood was thin and fields cracked under a merciless sun, suspicion grew. Whispers carried in the marketplaces. Has the pharaoh lost favor? Has he angered Hapi, the god of the flood? Fear turned into prayer, prayer into anxiety, and sometimes anxiety into rebellion. This delicate bond between river and ruler shaped Egyptian history as much as stone monuments or golden tombs. A pharaoh could command armies, build pyramids, and etch his name into eternity. But he could not control the Nile, and that humility, unspoken but constant, lingered in the minds of his subjects. Songs of the river. Every culture crafts songs around what sustains it, and Egypt was no different. Fishermen sang to the river in the early dawn, their voices rising with the mist. Songs of gratitude, songs of pleading, songs to quiet their own fears. Mothers rocked their babies with lullabies about the Nile's embrace, painting images of gentle waters that would never abandon them. Priests sang hymns within temple walls, their voices echoing off stone, praising the divine spirit believed to live within the current. Even in times of hunger, music was never silent. The thin strings of harps, the hollow thump of drums, the whisper of flutes carved from reeds, they all echoed the same truth: that the river was not just water, but memory, hope, and life woven into sound, trials of survival, and yet the Nile was never enough on its own. The desert pressed constantly against the people, a reminder that survival was a fragile art. Sandstorms could sweep across villages, burying fields and choking livestock. Crocodiles lurked beneath the waters, patient and silent hunters. Malaria spread from marshes during the flood seasons, its fever felling the weak. When harvests failed, the riverbanks filled with gaunt figures. Children's stomachs swelled from hunger, their cries fading into silence. Mothers traded what little they owned for scraps of bread. Men left their villages in search of food, many never returning. These stories were told at night by firelight, not to frighten children, but to remind them that survival was sacred, and the Nile was a gift never to be taken for granted. "The desert waits for us," elders whispered. "If not for the river, it would have us all." Mysteries of the depths too most. The Nile's surface was a place of labor, but beneath it lay mysteries. Divers, brave men who searched for lost nets or sunken goods, spoke of treasures hidden in the depths. Some claimed to have seen strange creatures, half fish, half spirits, gliding through the darkness. Priests, always eager to strengthen the bond between the divine and the river, encouraged these stories. They spoke of gods walking within the waters, of spirits who carried the prayers of the people downstream to the sea and beyond. Children loved these tales most of all. They imagined gods with scales of silver, hair of flowing reeds, eyes that glowed like lanterns in the deep. The Nile was no longer just a river, it was a realm, another world flowing alongside their own. Nightfall on the banks, the sun set and shadows lengthened. The Nile transformed. Fires flickered along the banks as families cooked thin stews and baked flatbread on stone hearths. The air was filled with the mingling scents of smoke, river mud, and lentils. Elders sat on mats woven from reeds, their voices carrying stories of gods and kings. Children leaned close, their faces glowing in the firelight, listening to legends of Osiris, of Isis, of Hapi, who blessed their waters. The river shimmered nearby, reflecting starlight like a pathway into eternity. Some nights, the pharaoh's barge glided silently across the water, torches lining its sides. From the banks, peasants looked up in awe, bowing their heads as the ruler passed, his silhouette outlined against the golden glow. To them, it was not just a man sailing across the river, it was the embodiment of divine will, moving upon the lifeline of their world. Eternal companion, the Nile was patient. It had watched generations rise and fall. It had seen villages swell into towns, towns into cities, and kings rise from obscurity to carve their names into stone. It had swallowed lives, nourished fields, and carried the prayers of millions across time. To the Egyptians, it was not just a river, it was an eternal companion, a mirror of their struggles, their hopes, their faith. In its waters, they saw themselves fragile yet enduring, small yet part of something vast and sacred. When they dreamed of the Nile. When they prayed with the Nile in mind. When they told stories to their children, it was the river that formed the thread binding every tale together. And as they closed their eyes each night, the soft lull of the current whispered them into sleep, reminding them that as long as the Nile flowed, life, however fragile, would continue. The birth of villages long before the pharaohs carved their names into monuments, long before temples rose toward the heavens. Life in Egypt began as clusters of mud brick homes along the Nile's edge. These settlements, modest in size, were born not out of grandeur but out of necessity. The desert was too cruel to allow wandering. Only by the river could families find the means to endure. The first huts were nothing more than reeds bound with mud, fragile shelters against the burning sun. Over time, these evolved into sturdier structures, bricks baked in the sun until they hardened like stone. Walls were thick to shield against heat, windows small to keep interiors cool. Inside, floors were layered with mats, and simple clay pots lined the shelves. What united these dwellings was their closeness to the river. No matter how humble or prosperous a family might be, distance from the Nile was unthinkable. To step too far away was to step into the domain of death. The desert, endless and unforgiving. The village at dawn, when the first light of morning touched the settlements, the rhythm of survival began. Smoke rose from hearths as women ground grain into flour, their hands steady on stone querns that had passed through generations. Children darted through narrow alleys, their laughter mingling with the braying of donkeys and the lowing of cattle. Men emerged from their homes carrying tools, wooden plows, baskets for seed, fishing nets. The Nile called to each of them in its own way. Some would till the fields, others would cast their nets, still others would ferry goods across its waters. Each village was a small world, bound by routine yet held together by resilience. Neighbors shared tools, food, and stories. When one family struggled, another stepped in. In times of scarcity, this unity was not just kindness but survival itself. Social life, by the banks' life along the river banks, was never silent. The villages pulsed with voices, the sounds of barter and exchange, of gossip and laughter. Markets sprouted in open courtyards, where farmers laid out baskets of onions, garlic, beans, and dates. Fishermen displayed their catches, scales glistening in the sun. Potters showed off jars and bowls fresh from the kiln, their surfaces still warm. Barter was the lifeblood of these gatherings. Few peasants held coins. Instead, they traded what they had: a basket of fish for a measure of barley, a pot for a sheaf of flax. These exchanges were more than economics, they were bonds of trust and community. Festivals and rituals punctuated the cycle of work. On holy days, villagers gathered at shrines by the river, their chants and offerings carrying into the water. Children sang songs, dancers stamped their feet in dust, and music filled the air with rhythms that echoed the heartbeat of the Nile. The river, as divider and bridge though the Nile gave life, it also divided. Settlements stretched along both banks, sometimes close enough to see smoke rising from across the water, yet separated by the wide, flowing current. Boats were the answer. Dugouts made from single logs, rafts bound with reeds, and eventually larger wooden vessels became the bridges between worlds. Ferrymen rowed tirelessly, carrying people, animals, and goods back and forth. Their songs rose above the splash of oars, steady rhythms that turned labor into music. These crossings were more than practical. They bound the riverbanks into a single community. A wedding on one side was attended by neighbors from the other. A shortage in one village was eased by grain ferried across the water. The Nile, in this way, was both barrier and bond. Homes of clay and reed. Walking through a settlement, one would see a tapestry of mud brick homes, narrow alleys, and small courtyards. Walls bore the handprints of those who built them, children's fingerprints still pressed into clay, hardened by the sun. Roofs were flat, often used for sleeping on hot nights when the air inside became unbearable. Families climbed ladders to lie beneath the stars, the cool night breeze offering relief. Inside, life was simple but carefully ordered. Clay ovens sat in corners, baskets of grain were sealed with mud to keep away pests, and tools leaned neatly against walls. Oil lamps cast a warm glow at dusk, their flickering flames making shadows dance across walls painted with simple decorations. The humblest huts stood beside larger homes, but even the wealthiest in the village lived with modesty compared to the splendor of palaces in the cities. Here, life was about endurance, not excess. Night along the riverbanks when darkness fell. The villages settled into a quiet hum. Fires glowed in courtyards as families ate simple meals, bread baked fresh, lentil stews flavored with onions or garlic, perhaps a piece of dried fish. Children dozed early, lulled by the drone of cicadas and the gentle lap of the river. Elders sat together, telling tales of gods and ancestors, their voices carrying wisdom shaped by decades of hardship. Young men and women lingered at the water's edge, whispering dreams of love, marriage, and futures that seemed as unpredictable as the Nile's flood. Above them, the stars glittered with sharp clarity. In the desert, the heavens seemed close enough to touch. The villagers looked upward and felt both small and eternal, threads woven into a tapestry that stretched far beyond their lifetimes. The pulse of community. Every settlement along the Nile was a living heartbeat, its rhythm set not by clocks but by the river's moods. Unlike the grand cities of Thebes or Memphis, these villages thrived quietly, unrecorded in stone, remembered only in the stories carried by descendants. Yet they were the true foundation of Egypt's survival. It was in these small places that the majority of the population lived: peasants, craftsmen, fishermen, and herders. Their names were rarely inscribed on tombs, their deeds seldom praised in temple walls, yet it was their sweat that fed the nation, their resilience that carried Egypt through centuries of trials. When the river blessed them, laughter echoed through narrow streets. When the river betrayed them, the silence of hunger filled the air. And through it all, they endured, bound together by shared struggle. Crafts and labor. Life along the riverbanks was not only about farming and fishing. Settlements bustled with crafts that kept society alive: Potters sat beside their wheels, spinning clay into jars, bowls, and amphorae that would store grain, beer, and oil. The air around their workshop smelled of earth and fire, as kilns smoked beneath the desert sun. Weavers worked with flax harvested from the fields, spinning it into linen that clothed both peasants and pharaohs. Their looms creaked with steady rhythm, threads stretching and twisting under practiced fingers. Children helped by collecting reeds or dyeing threads in clay basins filled with natural pigments, reds from ochre, blues from indigo, yellows from saffron. Carpenters shaped wood brought from distant lands, for Egypt's own trees were scarce. From their tools came plows, boats, stools, and chests, each carved with skill and patience. Blacksmiths, rare but invaluable, hammered bronze into blades, sickles, and nails, their forges glowing like miniature suns. These crafts were not luxuries, they were the very tools of survival. Without them, fields could not be plowed, food could not be stored, homes could not stand. Children of the river, the youngest members of the villages, grew up with the Nile as their constant companion. They splashed in the shallows, chased one another through dusty alleys, and played games with pebbles and sticks. Their laughter was the music of resilience, proof that even in hardship, life found joy. Education, in the formal sense, was rare in these villages. Most children never learned to read or write. That skill was reserved for scribes in temples and palaces. Instead, children learned the wisdom of survival: how to mend nets, how to plant seeds, how to listen for signs in the wind or the river's flow. Boys followed their fathers into fields or onto fishing boats, their small hands eager to help, their eyes absorbing every movement. Girls shadowed their mothers, carrying jars, grinding grain, and learning the sacred art of stretching meager food into meals that could sustain a family. Though their futures were hard, their spirits were strong. They grew not with the promise of luxury, but with the certainty of belonging to the river, to the land, to one another. The weight of famine, yet, even within these thriving settlements, shadows lingered. A failed flood could turn laughter into wailing overnight. Hunger gnawed at bellies, and the streets that once echoed with chatter grew silent. Famine tested the fabric of community. Families stretched their stores, rationing bread into ever thinner slices. Clay jars that once brimmed with grain now sat nearly empty, their lids sealed in vain hope. Mothers whispered reassurances to children whose ribs showed beneath their skin. In such times, the settlements became places of both desperation and unity. Neighbors who had once shared freely now measured carefully, torn between protecting their own and helping others. Some families fled, seeking refuge in cities where royal granaries sometimes offered relief. Others stayed, bound by land and hope, waiting for the river to rise again. These memories lingered in every generation, shaping traditions of gratitude and caution. When the harvest was abundant, villagers never forgot the hunger of lean years. Bread was blessed before being eaten, not out of ritual alone, but out of lived memory. Faith and fear, religion, was the thread that stitched these settlements together. Shrines dotted the riverbanks, simple altars of stone where offerings were left for the gods. Villagers prayed to Hapi for the flood, to Osiris for the cycle of life and death, to Isis for protection and fertility. Even in humble huts, households kept small clay figures of deities. A fisherman's family might honor Toret, the goddess of childbirth, while a farmer prayed to Min for fertility of crops. Every act of labor was infused with prayer: when seeds were sown, when nets were cast, when bread was baked. But, alongside faith came fear. Omens were read in the flight of birds, in the behavior of animals, in the strange patterns of clouds. A sudden illness or a failed crop was not mere misfortune. It was a sign that gods or spirits had been angered. Superstitions spread like wildfire, whispered from one doorway to another. Faith was not just belief, was survival. To live without it was unthinkable, in a land where so much depended on forces beyond human control. A night of celebration, every night along the riverbanks, was heavy with labor or hunger. In times of abundance, joy filled the settlements. Drums beat through the air, flutes sang, and villagers gathered in circles to dance. Torches lit the banks, their reflections trembling on the river's surface. Children laughed as they chased sparks from the fire. Women clapped their hands to the rhythm of drums, their eyes shining in the firelight. Men raised jars of beer, toasting to the gods, to the river, to one another. These festivals were more than celebrations. They were defiance against the desert's cruelty, proof that even in a land of hardship, life could be sweet. They were moments of release where villagers forgot hunger, toil, and fear, and simply existed in the glow of fire, song, and kinship. Eternal settlements, though centuries have passed. The essence of these riverbank villages lingers in memory. They were not grand, yet they were eternal. Every mud brick wall, every reed roof, every clay jar was part of the larger story of Egypt's endurance. Civilization did not rise in palaces or temples. Alone it rose in these small, fragile places where men and women lived and died in rhythm with the Nile. Without them, there would have been no builders for the pyramids, no farmers to feed armies, no storytellers to pass on myths. The settlements were Egypt's true spine, humble yet unyielding, fragile yet eternal. And as the Nile flowed, so too did their legacy, carried onward like a whisper into the ages. The desert sun did not simply shine, it ruled. From the moment it rose above the eastern horizon, its rays bore down with relentless force, swallowing shade and baking the earth until it cracked. The ancient Egyptians, though accustomed to its tyranny, never underestimated it. To live in Egypt was to live under the gaze of a fire that never relented. For peasants in the fields, the sun was both friend and enemy. Its warmth allowed crops to grow, but its unyielding heat drained the body of strength. Men bent over plows, their backs glistening with sweat as oxen pulled heavy wooden beams through the soil. The air shimmered above the fields, blurring the horizon as if the world itself wavered under the burden of the sun. Women worked in courtyards, grinding grain or kneading dough, their skin browned and toughened by years of exposure. Even children were not spared. Errands and chores pressed them into the open air, where they squinted and shielded their eyes with hands too small to ward off the light. Shade was precious. A single palm tree could gather beneath it workers, animals, and children alike, all desperate for a moment's relief. Mud brick homes with their thick walls stayed cool inside, but only if one could remain indoors. Most could not. Survival demanded labor, and labor demanded endurance beneath the desert sun. Sandstorms on the horizon. If the sun was an eternal adversary, the sandstorm was its sudden fury. One moment the desert lay still, vast and silent. The next, winds rose with a howl, carrying clouds of sand that blotted out the sky. Villagers knew the signs, the strange darkening of the horizon, the sudden silence of birds, the sharp sting of grit carried by the first gusts. When the warning came, chaos followed. Mothers herded children indoors, men secured animals, doors and shutters were barred, pots of water were covered, food sealed, and every crack in walls stuffed with cloth or red to keep out the storm's reach. Those caught outside wrapped their heads in linen, bent low, and prayed to find shelter before the storm's heart descended. Inside the huts, darkness swallowed the rooms. Sand pressed through every gap, coating mats, jars, and skin alike. The storm howled like a living creature, rattling doors, shaking roofs, and filling the air with a sound like the roar of thousands of drums. When at last it passed, the world lay buried in dust. Fields disappeared beneath blankets of sand, homes half buried, and the river itself hidden beneath a haze of grit. Villagers emerged like ghosts, coughing and blinking, their lives disrupted yet again by the desert's wrath. Labor in heat. Daily life in the settlements meant facing this heat and these storms with stoic endurance. Farmers rose before dawn, working in the cool hours when the light was still gentle. They hurried to sow seeds, water fields, and tend animals before the furnace of midday arrived. By noon, many retreated indoors, where the thick mud walls offered some protection. Work resumed in the late afternoon, when the sun dipped and shadows stretched long across the land. Even with these precautions, heat claimed lives. The elderly, the sick, and sometimes even the strong collapsed in the fields, their bodies overwhelmed by exhaustion and thirst. Priests said such deaths were offerings to Ra, the sun god, whose power was too great to endure for all. Families mourned, but they also understood life in the desert was always a negotiation between endurance and surrender. Coping with fire and dust, the Egyptians learned to adapt in countless ways. Clothing was light and airy, linen woven loosely to let the skin breathe, head coverings shielded against the sun, while eyes squinted perpetually against the glare. Water jars were placed in shaded corners, their porous clay keeping the contents cool through natural evaporation. Homes were built with flat roofs, often used as sleeping platforms during the hottest nights. Entire families would climb ladders to lie beneath the stars, catching the faint desert breeze. Mats were dampened with water and spread across floors to cool the air. Sandstorms demanded their own adaptations. Cloth wrappings were always kept nearby, ready to cover faces when storms came suddenly. Villages built walls of reeds and mud to break the wind's force, though no barrier could truly stop the desert. After each storm, communities worked together to clear sand, repair damage, and dig fields free once more. The spirituals for the sun and the sand were not seen merely as whether they were forces of the divine. The sun god, was worshipped with awe and fear. His daily journey across the sky was both a blessing and a trial. Without him, there would be no light, no crops, no life. With him, there was endless heat, suffering, and exhaustion. To live in Egypt was to walk this paradox daily. Sandstorms, too, carried spiritual meaning. Many believed they were the breath of angry gods, or the passing of spirits unsettled in the desert wastes. Priests offered incense and chants after storms, seeking to calm the unseen forces. Mothers whispered protective prayers over their children, tracing symbols on their foreheads with fingers dipped in water. In these beliefs, the harshness of the desert became more than suffering, it became part of a larger story. To endure the sun and storms was not only survival but also devotion, proof of the people's faith and resilience. The silent threat of dehydration in a land where the sun never seemed to tire. Water was the line between life and death. The Nile provided plenty, but it was never simple to carry its gift from river to home, from home to field. Each jar of water was heavy, and yet each drop was precious. Women walked long paths with clay jars balanced on their heads, their footsteps steady, their pace unbroken. Children learned early to respect this burden. To spill water was to waste survival. Villages had sayings, passed down like prayers. Spill grain, and you lose a meal. Spill water, and you lose a life. Even animals were guided carefully, their thirst balanced against the family's own. When sandstorms raged, water was covered, hidden, and guarded. Sand fouled jars, seeped into mouths, and burned throats. The storm ended, but thirst lingered long after. The cost of labor work in such conditions wore the body down quickly. Men's hands hardened like stone from hours gripping tools. Women's backs bent from endless grinding and lifting. Heat cracked the skin, split lips, and turned eyes raw from glare and dust. Some bore scars from the sun itself, skin blistered and darkened, pain etched deep into muscle and bone. These wounds were not the result of war or weapons, but of the daily battle against weather. Still, labor continued. To stop was to starve. To rest too long was to invite hunger. Survival demanded movement, even when every step felt heavier than the last. Children and the desert, though the adults endured much, the youngest bore their share as well. Children ran through the dust, their feet toughened by the earth, their lungs filled with sand. Some grew ill from the harsh winds, their small bodies unable to withstand what their parents could. Families mourned quietly, understanding that the desert claimed its share of life, but children were also resilient. They found games in the dust, laughter in the heat, joy even in storms. They chased each other through alleys, played with carved dolls and sticks, and splashed in shallow pools of Nile water when allowed. Their laughter was a kind of defiance, a reminder that even under the desert's rule, the human spirit could not be broken. The sand in daily life, sand was everywhere. It seeped into food, into beds, into lungs. No home, however carefully sealed, was safe from its intrusion. Mothers brushed it from their children's faces as they slept. Men spit grit from their mouths after hours of work. Even in temples, priests swept sand from the floors before offering prayers. And yet, sand was part of their existence. It was the desert's reminder: you live only because the river allows it. Remove the Nile, and sand will cover all. That's understanding bred humility. No matter how powerful Egypt became, no matter how high its monuments rose, its people knew the desert waited patiently. Eternal and unyielding, lessons of resilience. Generations grew under this sun and these storms, and each generation learned new ways to endure. They passed down techniques for wrapping cloth tightly around the face, for building homes that cooled naturally, for planting crops in rows that shielded one another from the drying winds. They taught their children to rise early, to respect the strength of the sun, to conserve water and food, and to never take a season of abundance for granted. Resilience was not optional, it was woven into their very identity. And so, When storms howled and heat pressed down, the people of the Nile endured. They bowed their heads, tightened their grips on tools, whispered prayers to their gods, and pressed forward, nights of rest yet for all its cruelty. The desert also gave nights of peace. When the sun sank and the sky darkened, the air cooled, and families emerged onto rooftops to sleep beneath the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, mirroring the Nile below. Children fell asleep to the sound of crickets. Parents lay with the cool breeze on their faces, and elders whispered blessings for another day survived. In these moments, the desert felt less like an enemy and more like a quiet companion. And when dawn returned, the cycle began again, the struggle, the heat, the storms, the resilience. This was the rhythm of Egyptian life, as constant and unchanging as the desert itself. The gift of the flood. Each year, when the Nile swelled with its mysterious waters, the land was transformed. Dry earth, cracked by months of merciless sun, softened under the river's touch. The flood spread out across the banks, spilling into canals and fields, turning brown dust into dark, fertile soil. For the Egyptians, this was not disaster, it was renewal, a yearly resurrection. But the flood, though generous, was unpredictable. Too little water meant famine, too much meant destruction. And so, the Egyptians learned not only to accept the river's rhythm but to guide it, bending its power toward their survival. From this need was born one of their greatest achievements: irrigation. Canals of life with wooden tools, baskets, and bare hands. Peasants dug canals from the river into the fields. These channels crisscrossed the land like veins, carrying the Nile's lifeblood where it was needed most. Some were small ditches dug by families for their own crops, while others stretched for miles. Projects undertaken by entire villages. The work was grueling. Under the scorching sun, men carved through soil, lifting baskets of earth and piling them into walls. Women carried water jars to moisten the ground and cool the workers. Children gathered reeds to reinforce canal edges. It was not the work of kings, but of common hands, done year after year to ensure survival. When the canals filled, water flowed silently into fields of wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. Farmers watched with relief as the soil darkened, their crops drinking deeply of the river's gift. Without these canals, even the Nile's generosity would not be enough. The shadoof, among the most ingenious tools of irrigation, was the shadoof, simple in design but vital in function. It was nothing more than a long wooden pole balanced on a pivot, with a bucket tied to one end and a counterweight on the other. With this device, a farmer could lift water from the river or a canal and pour it into higher fields. The bucket dipped, filled, and rose again with ease, guided by hands that repeated the motion hundreds of times a day. It was a rhythm as steady as breathing: dip, lift, pour, return. Boys often worked the shadoofs, their young muscles straining but their spirits bright. Songs accompanied the labor, turning toil into ritual. Fathers taught sons how to balance the pole, how to keep the counterweight true. In this way, knowledge passed down like inheritance, binding generations together. The farmer's calendar, the Nile cycles, created the Egyptian calendar of farming. Akit, the season of the flood, when canals were dug and repaired, and fields lay submerged. Pare, the season of growth, when seeds were sown into the rich soil left by retreating waters. Shemu, the season of harvest, when fields turned golden, and sickles cut grain that would feed the people for another year. Each season was marked with rituals and festivals. During Akit, offerings were made to Hapi, asking for balance. During Pare, prayers sought protection for young shoots. During Shemu, songs and dances filled the air, celebrating abundance. The calendar was not just a tool of time, it was a sacred rhythm of survival. Crops of the Nile, the fields along the riverbanks, yielded crops that sustained not only bodies but culture itself. Wheat and barley formed the base of every meal, ground into flour for bread or brewed into beer. Flax provided linen, spun into garments light enough to endure the desert sun. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and beans flavored meals and gave strength to laborers. Fruit trees dotted the settlements, figs, dates, and pomegranates offering sweetness in a land of hardship. Sycamores shaded courtyards, while palms provided both fruit and material for baskets and mats. Each harvest was a blessing. Each loaf of bread, each jar of beer, each basket of figs was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed but earned. Season after season. Unity in the field's irrigation was never the work of one family alone. Canals demanded many hands, and so entire villages labored together. Men dug, women carried, children fetched, and elders oversaw. Work songs rose in unison, steady and rhythmic, echoing across the fields. In these moments, survival was shared. Grain harvested by one family might feed another. A canal dug by many hands might save a village. The Nile gave life, but unity ensured it endured. At the end of long days, families gathered in courtyards, eating bread baked from the first grains of the season, drinking beer brewed from barley, their voices filled with laughter despite their exhaustion. This unity was their true wealth, richer than gold, stronger than monuments. Tools of the earth, the Egyptians had no iron plows or great machines. Their tools were simple, carved from wood, strengthened by stone or bronze. Yet in their hands, these tools shaped civilizations. Farmers carried wooden hoes, their edges sharpened with flint, sickles made of curved wood, and inset with sharp stone blades sliced through grain with steady swipes. Wooden plows, drawn by oxen, cut furrows into the soil. Though crude by modern measure, in their time they were wonders, extensions of human endurance that multiplied the work of hands and backs. Each tool carried stories. Fathers passed sickles to sons, handles worn smooth from years of use. Mothers taught daughters how to grind grain with stone corns, showing the rhythm that kept families fed. These tools were more than objects. They were lifelines, binding generations in the endless struggle with earth and water. Water storage and preservation. Even with the Nile, water had to be preserved carefully. Families stored it in clay jars shaped to keep liquids cool. The porous clay allowed for slow evaporation, cooling the contents within. In courtyards, rows of jars stood shaded by reed mats, each covered with cloth to keep out insects and sand. For villages farther from the river, wells were dug, reaching deep into the ground to tap hidden veins of water. Drawing from these wells was laborious, but it ensured survival when floods receded and canals dried. Water was rationed with care. Each member of the family drank from the same jars, each animal given measured portions. To waste water was unthinkable. It was a crime, not against man but against the gods themselves. The harvest. At last came Shemu, the season of harvest. By this time, fields shimmered with gold under the blazing sun. Stalks of grain stood tall, heavy with life. Families rose before dawn, sickles in hand, and worked until the day's last light. The harvest was both joyous and exhausting. Songs filled the air as stalks fell, tied into bundles, and carried into storage. Grain was piled high in clay-lined pits or sealed in granaries, guarded carefully against rats and thieves. When the harvest was plentiful, the village rejoiced. Bread ovens glowed with fire, beer foamed in clay jars, and dates and figs sweetened meals. Families shared feasts beneath the stars, thanking the Nile and the gods for their mercy. When the harvest was poor, silence hung heavy. Faces turned to the sky in desperate prayer. Stores were rationed carefully, every handful of grain stretched to last. Rituals of gratitude. The end of harvest was marked by festivals. Villagers carried baskets of bread, jars of beer, and fruits to shrines, laying them before statues of Hapi, Osiris, and Isis. Priests chanted blessings, incense curled upward, and dancers stamped their feet in the dust, their movements echoing ancient rhythms. Children sang songs of thanks, their voices rising with innocence and hope. Elders told stories of past floods, years of plenty, years of famine, reminding the young that gratitude must never be forgotten. For the Nile was generous but never bound by promise. These rituals wove faith into survival. They were not mere superstition but a way of acknowledging dependence on forces greater than human strength. The eternal balance. Egyptians mastered irrigation not to conquer nature but to live in balance with it. They guided the river's waters, but they did not attempt to control them completely. They built canals and shadufs, but they still prayed to the gods for mercy. They harvested grain with skill, but they never forgot that one failed flood could undo it all. This humility was their strength. Unlike kingdoms that rose and fell in defiance of nature, Egypt endured for millennia by listening, adapting, and respecting the rhythm of the Nile. And so, under the endless desert sky, with the river flowing eternal, Egyptians bent their backs in labor, lifted water from canals, sowed seeds, and reaped harvests. They sang as they worked, prayed as they rested, and taught their children the same ancient truths, that survival was not a gift. It was a craft and art of patience, endurance, and reverence. The miracle of the flood. Each year, as the days grew long and the heat seemed unbearable, the Nile performed its most mysterious act, From distant lands unseen by Egyptian eyes, waters poured into its veins, swelling the river until it rose above its banks. Fields disappeared beneath the current. Villages braced for its force. And yet this was no disaster. This was the moment of renewal. The Egyptians did not fear the flood as other peoples might have. They revered it. They called it the inundation, a sacred tide that erased the scars of drought and prepared the soil for new life. Without it, the land would wither into desert. With it, Egypt blossomed into a green ribbon against endless sands. Hapi, the god of the flood, to explain such wonder. The Egyptians turned to divinity. The flood was not chance or accident, it was the work of Hapi, the god of the Nile's bounty. Hapi was not pictured as fierce or warlike, but as a plump figure with flowing breasts and a gentle belly, symbolizing abundance and nourishment. He carried offerings of food and water, his very form a promise of fertility. To peasants, Hapi was both friend and savior. Temples dedicated to Hapi echoed with hymns when the waters rose. Priests poured libations, casting jugs of milk and wine into the river as offerings. Children placed garlands of lotus and papyrus on the currents, watching them drift as gifts for the god. Families whispered prayers at dawn, their voices mingling with the river's song, the balance of life and death. Yet the flood was never entirely merciful. A poor flood brought famine, a rich one brought prosperity, but a flood too great brought destruction. Entire villages could vanish under rushing waters, livestock swept away, homes reduced to rubble. This paradox was woven into Egyptian thought, that abundance and danger were two sides of the same coin. The flood was a blessing, but also a test. To endure it was to prove worthiness. To fail was to invite despair. Elders told stories of years when the waters rose too high, when families clung to rooftops as currents surged through fields, when temples themselves trembled under the river's force. They told also of years when the flood was too low, when fields cracked open and hunger hollowed out entire generations. In both cases, the lesson was clear. Survival required humility before the flood's power. Nilometers and priests to measure the flood was to measure fate. Along the river's banks, stone staircases called nilometers descended into the water. Each step bore marks that told how high the water had risen. Priests watched carefully, noting levels with solemn faces. When waters rose just right, the priests declared blessings, promising a season of abundance. When they were too low or too high, their warnings filled villages with dread. Farmers looked to these priests as interpreters of divine will, their voices carrying more weight than any ruler's decree. Scribes recorded these levels, etching them into scrolls that chronicled Egypt's lifeline year after year. In this way, the flood was not only a natural event but a part of history itself, preserved in ink as much as in soil. Rituals of gratitude. With the flood came festivals. Villagers painted their faces, sang songs, and carried offerings to the river's edge. Clay figurines of Hapi were cast into the water, symbols of devotion. Dancers moved in circles, their feet splashing in shallow waters, their laughter carrying across the current. These were not only acts of worship but of joy. After months of hunger and fear, the flood brought relief. Bread ovens filled once more, beer brewed richly, fish swam in swollen waters. Families gathered to feast, their voices filled with songs of gratitude. The flood and the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh's power was tied to the flood as surely as the peasant's harvest. Though he wore crowns of gold and ruled from palaces of stone, even he could not command the Nile. His authority was measured not only in armies and monuments, but in the fertility of the land. When the flood was generous, the Pharaoh's image shone brighter. Poets praised him as the chosen of the gods, the one who secured balance and prosperity. Temples rang with hymns to both king and deity, their names entwined in gratitude. But when the flood failed, whispers spread. Did the Pharaoh anger Hapi? Had he lost favor with the divine? Grain shortages led to unrest, and unrest to rebellion. Thus, every rise and fall of the water carried political weight, shaping dynasties as much as harvests. Stories by firelight families told tales of the flood on nights when the stars burned bright. Elders described waters that gleamed like molten silver under moonlight, creeping higher each night until fields disappeared. They spoke of the joy of seeing fish swim through village streets, of children chasing eels with laughter. Other tales were darker floods that rose too high, sweeping away granaries and homes, leaving families to cling to rafts of reeds. Children listened, wide-eyed, learning that the flood was not to be taken lightly. It was both gift and trial, mercy and warning. symbols in art and story. The inundations seeped into every corner of Egyptian culture. On temple walls, artists carved scenes of gods pouring water from jars, symbols of abundance flowing into fields. Papyrus scrolls showed Hapi binding Upper and Lower Egypt together, his figure uniting the two lands through the gift of the flood. Songs praised the flood as the bringer of green, the one who made barley tall and wheat heavy. Priests recited hymns, "Hail to you, O Nile, who comes to give life to Egypt." Even the afterlife drew upon this imagery. In tombs, fields of reeds were painted as eternal paradises, where the dead would live in abundance, their crops never failing, their rivers always full. To dream of the afterlife was to dream of an eternal flood, free from fear or famine. The science of the flood. Though Egyptians clothed the flood in myth, they also studied it with precision. Scribes recorded water levels, priests announced predictions, and farmers adjusted their planting accordingly. This careful observation was one of the earliest forms of agricultural science. They understood that when the water receded, it left behind silt, dark, rich soil that nourished crops better than any other. They timed their planting not by the stars alone but by the river's retreat, watching for the moment when Earth was ready to receive seed. In this blend of myth and science, the Egyptians thrived. They prayed to Hapi, but they also measured with Nil. They offered bread to the gods, but they also sowed with skill. It was this balance of reverence and practicality that allowed their civilization to endure for thousands of years. Eternal rhythm. The flood was more than an event. It was the rhythm of life itself. It shaped the calendar, the religion, the politics, and the daily routines of the people. To live in Egypt was to live by the flood, to wait for it, to celebrate it, to fear it, to depend on it utterly. Even now, when one walks along the Nile's banks and feels the breeze carry the scent of water over desert sand, one can imagine the voices of those who lived long ago, voices of gratitude, of song, of whispered prayers at dawn. For them, the flood was not just water. It was life reborn each year. It was the breath of the gods, the heartbeat of the land, the eternal promise that the desert would not claim them yet. The fragility of abundance. When the harvest was gathered, when granaries filled with grain and jars overflowed with beer, there was always a shadow in every household's heart, the fear that abundance might vanish. The Egyptians knew well that a single poor flood, a swarm of locusts, or the creeping spread of rot could undo months of labor. Thus, preservation was not luxury, but survival. Food could not be consumed as quickly as it was gathered. It had to be stretched across the long seasons of uncertainty, carried carefully through months when the Nile was low and the desert pressed close. Every family, from peasant to noble, became a guardian of their stores. Their homes were not only places of rest, but fortresses against hunger. The granaries. At the heart of every settlement stood the granary structures of clay and mud brick, built high to keep food safe from floodwaters, rodents, and thieves. Their rounded walls and narrow entrances were designed with purpose, to trap cool air, to discourage pests, and to hold back decay. Workers carried grain in woven baskets, pouring it into the dark chambers where it would rest until needed. Scribes stood by, tallying the stores with red pens, marking down every sack and basket. To them, these numbers were not mere records, they were measures of survival. Fortunes written not in gold but in barley and wheat. In times of plenty, granaries swelled with abundance. In times of scarcity, their emptiness rang louder than drums, a silence that haunted entire villages. Bread and beer too. Staples of the Egyptian diet, bread and beer were, themselves, acts of preservation. Grain, ground into flour and baked into loaves, lasted longer than raw harvests. Beer, brewed from barley, provided not only sustenance but also safe hydration when water grew foul or scarce. Families baked bread daily, but they also prepared dried loaves that could be stored for weeks. Beer was brewed in clay jars, sealed with mud caps, and tucked into cool corners of homes. These staples carried peasants through lean times, their humble taste a reminder of the Nile's gift. Drying and salting fruits and fish, too, were preserved with care. Dates and figs were laid out beneath the sun, their sweetness concentrated as they dried. These became delicacies that lasted far longer than fresh fruit, treats that carried children through the hunger of winter months. Fish, abundant in the Nile, were caught in great numbers during the floods. Families cleaned them carefully, rubbed them with salt, and laid them to dry on red mats. Once hardened by sun and air, the fish were stored in jars, ready to be eaten when fresh catches grew scarce. These methods were simple, born of necessity, but they carried the wisdom of centuries. The desert was harsh, but it was also the perfect ally for drying, its heat turning perishables into long-lasting stores. The role of women preservation was often the work of women, their hands guiding the rhythm of survival. They ground grain, baked bread, brewed beer, salted fish, and dried fruit. Their knowledge of storage, how to seal jars, how to keep pests away, how to stretch meager supplies was as vital as any plow or tool. They passed down recipes and rituals, teaching daughters to honor every grain, to never waste, to treat food as sacred. In their hands, survival became not only labor but art. Faith in preservation of food storage carried spiritual meaning. Offerings placed in tombs included jars of grain, dried fish, and bread loaves, ensuring that the dead would never hunger in the afterlife. This belief mirrored the living world. To preserve food was to preserve life itself. Families prayed over their stores, asking the gods to protect them from rot, vermin, or theft. In this way, even the humblest clay jar became an object of devotion, a vessel holding not only food but hope. Guarding the store's food was not only threatened by rot and insects, it was threatened by people. In lean years, hunger could drive neighbors to desperate acts. For this reason, granaries were often guarded, sometimes by men of the community, sometimes by soldiers assigned by the pharaoh himself. Locks of rope and clay seals marked each storage entrance. A broken seal meant theft or tampering, a crime taken with utmost seriousness. Grain was life, and to steal grain was to steal survival. Even in peasant homes, small storage jars were hidden away, buried in cool sand or tucked beneath reed mats. Families whispered about their stores, never boasting, never revealing too much. In times of scarcity, secrecy was safety. Seasons of plenty and want, the rhythm of preservation followed the rhythm of the Nile. At harvest time, storage rooms brimmed with sacks of barley and wheat, jars of dried figs, amphorae of beer. There was laughter then, a feeling of security as families stacked food high. But as months passed, as jars emptied and bread grew hard, that laughter dimmed. Every scoop of grain was measured carefully, every loaf divided with precision. Mothers rationed food with practiced skill, ensuring children had enough, even if it meant going hungry themselves. This cycle of plenty and want shaped the Egyptian spirit, grateful in abundance, resilient in scarcity. Preservation for the elite nobles and royals enjoyed greater luxury in their preservation. They stored honey, which never spoiled, as well as exotic oils and spices. Their meats were preserved not only with salt, but with elaborate methods, wrapped in herbs and resins. Some tombs revealed preserved delicacies meant to last eternity, dried ducks, sealed jars of wine, even carefully packed baskets of bread. These offerings reflected the belief that survival was not just for this life, but for the next. Innovation and ingenuity. Much of preservation relied on simple methods. There were moments of ingenuity. Clay jars were lined with resins to seal them tighter. Storage rooms were built underground to keep them cool. Scribes recorded notes about floods and harvests, helping communities plan how much food must be saved for future years. This quiet ingenuity, passed from generation to generation, helped Egypt endure, for while other empires rose and fell, Egypt's lifeline remained steady, anchored in knowledge as much as in faith. The emotional weight of storage for the peasant. Every full jar was comfort, every sealed basket a prayer answered. Children learned early to respect the stores, not to waste, not to steal. Fathers reminded sons that every loaf represented days of labor under the sun, every dried fig a blessing from the Nile. There was fear, too, fear of jars found spoiled, of stores stolen in the night, of the flood failing to replenish them. Yet, through fear, resilience grew. The Egyptians learned not only to store food but to store patience, endurance, and hope. Preservation as identity. The methods of storage became part of Egyptian identity itself. To visitors from foreign lands, Egypt seemed miraculous. How could a people survive in such a desert with such regularity? The answer lay in their mastery of preservation, their ability to stretch the Nile's gifts beyond the season of abundance. This mastery gave them stability, and stability gave them power. Pharaohs built empires not only with armies, but with granaries, with food security that allowed cities to flourish, temples to rise, and monuments to endure. eternal stores. Perhaps the most striking evidence of Egypt's devotion to preservation lies in the tombs. Their food was not stored for days or years, but for eternity. Clay jars sealed thousands of years ago still bear traces of wine and grain. Loaves of bread, blackened with age, remain intact in sealed chambers. To the Egyptians, the afterlife was a continuation of survival. Preservation was not temporary, it was eternal. Closing reflection. Food, storage and preservation were more than practical acts. They were rituals of love, of faith, of endurance. They bound families together, tied communities to the Nile, and secured Egypt's survival against desert, famine, and time itself. Each jar sealed, each loaf baked, each fish dried was a declaration: we will endure. The fragility of life in the desert and the land of Egypt, survival was never guaranteed. The desert sun scorched skin, sandstorms cut across villages, and insects carried fevers that struck without warning. Crops might fail, food might spoil, but it was sickness sudden and unseen that filled families with the greatest dread. From birth to death, life was a constant negotiation with fragility. A child's fever, a farmer's broken bone, a mother's labor, any of these could tip the balance between life and death. In such a world, medicine was not simply a craft, it was a sacred duty, a bridge between the human and the divine. The healers of the Nile, Egyptian healers, were men and women of unique status. They were not warriors or rulers, yet they commanded deep respect. Some were trained in temple schools, where scribes recorded remedies in papyrus scrolls. Others were village healers, their knowledge passed down orally, tied to the wisdom of mothers and grandmothers who had tended families for generations. Temples doubled as hospitals. Priests studied both ritual and remedy, seeing illness as a disturbance of balasa, misalignment between the body, the soul, and the gods. To heal was not merely to apply herbs, but to restore harmony. The papyrus of healing. The most treasured artifacts of Egyptian medicine are the medical papyri, scrolls inscribed with remedies, incantations, and observations. The Ebers Papyrus, dating back over 3 millennia, lists hundreds of treatments for ailments ranging from headaches to burns. Some prescriptions sound familiar: honey for wounds, a natural antiseptic; garlic for infections; willow bark for pain, the source of aspirin. Others blend ritual with remedy: an incantation whispered over herbs, a charm placed beside the sickbed, a prayer to Sekhmet, goddess of disease and healing. In these scrolls, one sees the Egyptian genius, a fusion of practical knowledge and spiritual faith, neither dismissed, both embraced. Herbs and remedies. The Nile's fertile banks provided a natural pharmacy. Garlic and onion were staples, believed to strengthen the body and fight disease. Workers who built the pyramids were fed garlic daily, both for health and for stamina. Honey was applied to cuts and burns, sealing wounds and preventing infection. Its sweetness carried not only healing but comfort. Frankincense and myrrh, imported through trade, were ground into salves and burned as incense, cleansing both body and spirit. Castor oil was used as a laxative, easing the burdens of digestion. Willow bark, steeped in water, soothed pain. Though Egyptians did not know its connection to what we call aspirin today, every plant had purpose, every leaf and root, a potential cure, surgery and physical healing. Though their tools were simple bronze knives, needles of bone, or metal, Egyptian healers were not afraid of surgery. They set broken bones, stitched wounds, and drained abscesses. Splints made of reeds or wood held bones in place, wrapped with linen strips soaked in resin for support. Dentistry too was practiced, though with limited success. Skulls reveal attempts at drilling cavities or removing decayed teeth. Pain relief was minimal, yet the effort shows their determination to fight suffering. However crude their methods may seem today, magic and medicine to the Egyptian mind, illness could not be separated from the spiritual. A cough might be caused by bad air, but also by the breath of an angry spirit. A fever might be the work of insects, but also the punishment of a god. Thus, healers combined herbs with magic. Amulets shaped like the Eye of Horus were worn for protection. Incantations were whispered as poultices were applied. Ritual baths in sacred waters were prescribed alongside salves of honey and oil. This dual approach offered comfort: the body treated with herbs, the spirit soothed by prayer. In both, hope was preserved. The people's trust for peasants' access to temple physicians was rare. Instead, they turned to wise women, midwives, and local healers. a grandmother's poultice of garlic and honey, a mother's chant whispered during childbirth, a father's careful wrapping of a broken limb. The small acts were the true foundation of survival. Such knowledge was communal, carried in memory and practice, not scrolls. It was fragile, passed from mouth to ear, yet it endured because it had to. Midwives and the mystery of childbirth was one of the greatest trials for Egyptian women, and midwives were among the most trusted figures in society. These women carried not only herbs and oils but also prayers and chants, guiding mothers through the dangerous passage of life-giving. Lotus oil was rubbed on the skin to ease pain, while charms of Tauret, the hippo-headed goddess of fertility, were placed nearby to ward off evil. Mothers squatted on birthing stools, gripping handles as the midwives whispered encouragement. Infant cries were celebrated as proof of survival. Offerings were given to the gods, thanking them for sparing both child and mother. Every successful birth was both miracle and triumph. The threat of disease, though Egyptians mastered many remedies, disease remained an ever-present shadow. Malaria thrived in marshlands, while tuberculosis scarred bones. Parasites crept into drinking water, their silent presence weakening bodies from within. Without modern understanding, Egyptians explained these illnesses as the work of malevolent forces, yet their treatments often showed remarkable intuition. Cleanliness, for instance, was highly valued. Priests shaved their bodies and bathed daily, reducing infection risks. Linen wrappings kept wounds clean. Honey sealed cuts. Though they lacked microscopes, they observed patterns, learning what eased suffering and what worsened it. Animals as healers. Animals, too, had their place in Egyptian medicine. Crocodile fat was used in ointments, though its effectiveness was doubtful. Cat's hair, or lizard parts, were sometimes included in remedies, reflecting the blending of magic with medicine. More practical was the use of ox liver, which provided vitamin A unknowingly, helping those with night blindness. Such remedies reveal how observation, even without scientific explanation, guided survival. The healer's burden. To be a healer in Egypt was to walk a line between science and spirit, between success and failure. A broken bone set correctly could save a life. A fever left unchecked could end it. The healer carried the weight of both gratitude and blame. Families brought offerings to thank healers, but also curses if healing failed. A healer's reputation was fragile, their role respected but perilous. Yet still, they served, their knowledge too valuable to abandon. The legacy of Egyptian medicine. What the Egyptians discovered did not vanish with them. Greek physicians studied Egyptian texts, carrying their wisdom forward. Even today, some practices remain familiar. Honey for wounds, herbs for pain, oils for relaxation. The Egyptians left not only monuments of stone but also monuments of knowledge, etched into papyrus and memory. Their pursuit of healing reminds us that survival is not only about food and shelter, but about care, compassion, and the hope that suffering can be eased. A reflection by the fire. Imagine an Egyptian peasant family gathered at night. A child coughs in the corner, his chest rising and falling with effort. The mother crushes garlic with honey, spooning it gently into his mouth. The father whispers a prayer to Sekhmet, asking her to spare the boy. A grandmother ties a charm around his neck, shaped like the eye of Horus. The family waits, the room heavy with fear and hope. Slowly, the child's breathing eases. Relief fills their hearts. Gratitude for herbs, for faith, for the fragile miracle of healing. Closing reflection. Medicine in Egypt was never just about the body. It was about the soul, the family, the community, and the eternal rhythm of survival in the desert. Herbs, prayers, amulets, and the healer's hands all worked together, weaving science and spirit into one. Through these efforts, countless lives were saved, countless sufferings eased. The Egyptians understood that to survive in the harsh desert, one needed not only bread and water, but also healing, and above all, hope. The hands that shaped survival. The desert was harsh, the Nile unpredictable, yet Egyptians thrived for thousands of years. Their survival was not just a gift of nature but the result of human ingenuity. With simple tools and clever crafts, they transformed raw materials into lifelines. Objects of wood, stone, reed, and copper that carried them through hunger, work, and worship. Every tool was more than an object. It was a bridge between fragility and endurance, between desert scarcity and the abundance of survival. Farming implements. The heart of survival was food, and food was won through labor in the fields. Farmers wielded hoes made of wood, their handles bound with rope, their blades sharpened with stone or metal. These humble tools turned soil heavy with silt into fertile ground ready for seed. Plows, pulled by oxen, dug furrows into the earth. Simple in design, yet powerful in effect, they multiplied the reach of a farmer's strength. Without these tools, fields would remain barren. With them, Egypt became the breadbasket of the ancient world. Sickles, crafted with flint teeth set into wooden handles, cut stalks of grain with remarkable efficiency. Each sweep of the sickle was an act of survival, filling baskets that would later feed entire families. The potter's wheel. Water was life, but water needed vessels. The potter's wheel, one of humanity's oldest inventions, spun clay into jars, bowls, and amphoras. Potters' hands shaped the Nile's mud into storage containers that carried grain, preserved beer, and held precious water across dry months. Kilns baked these vessels into lasting strength. Painted with symbols or left plain, each jar was both tool and treasure. Archaeologists still uncover them, their forms intact even after millennia, silent witnesses to a people's daily struggle and triumph. Basketry and redwork, abundant along the Nile, were transformed into baskets, mats, sandals, and even small boats. Baftery was an essential craft, practiced in nearly every household. A peasant's wife might weave baskets to carry grain, while fishermen crafted reed traps to catch fish in the shallows. Papyrus reeds gave birth to writing itself. Strips were pressed, dried, and layered into sheets that carried words across centuries. From healing recipes to royal decrees, papyrus transformed Egyptian knowledge into something eternal. Thus, even the humble reed became a tool of survival, shaping not only daily life but also history itself. Metal and stone, though wood and reed were common, stone and metal gave Egyptian tools endurance. Copper chisels carved limestone for homes and temples. Bronze knives sliced meat and trimmed reeds. Hammers of dolerite pounded stone blocks into shape, building monuments that still tower today. Tools were not only practical but symbols of mastery. To shape stone into blocks for pyramids was to declare victory over the desert's harshness. Each tool held the promise of permanence, of survival etched into earth itself. Fishing and hunting gear. Survival also meant turning river and land into sustenance. Fishermen used nets woven of flax, weighted with stones, to scoop fish from the Nile's current. Harpoons with barb tips pierced large catches, while small reed traps caught fish in shallow pools. Hunters carried bows of wood strung with sinew, arrows tipped with flint or bronze. Nets and lassos helped capture birds, which were plentiful along the riverbanks. Dogs aided hunters, their loyalty etched into tomb paintings. Every catch meant another day of survival, another meal in a land where hunger was never far away. Tools of the household within homes. Smaller tools sustained daily life. Mortar and pestles ground grain into flour. Stone grinders turned seeds into paste. Needles of bone and bronze stitched linen garments, ensuring protection from the desert sun. Oil lamps, carved from clay, gave light in the darkness, their small flames chasing away the endless night of the desert. Even children had tools, miniature toys of wood and clay that mimicked adult crafts. Through play, they learned survival, practicing the motions that one day would sustain their families. The carpenter's artwood was scarce in Egypt, yet carpenters shaped what they had into marvels of function and beauty. Acacia, sycamore, and imported cedar were carved into furniture. Plows, boats, and tools. Their saws, with blades of copper or bronze, cut planks that were joined with mortise and tenon joints, a technique so precise that some pieces survive intact after millennia. Mallets and adzes shaped wood into beams, while chisels etched detail into sacred shrines. Even a peasant's stool, roughly carved, bore the mark of a carpenter's skill, an object of utility, elevated into a companion of daily life. Boats, tools of travel and trade. The Nile was not only a source of water and food, it was the highway of Egypt. Boats were essential tools, crafted first from papyrus reeds, bound tightly together, later from wooden planks lashed with rope. Small reed boats carried fishermen into shallows, while great wooden vessels bore traders across long distances. The pharaoh's barges, adorned with painted sails, were floating symbols of power, but even they relied on the same basic craft as the peasant's skiff. Without boats, survival would have been impossible. The Nile's gift could not be fully embraced without vessels to ride its currents. Tools of writing, food and shelter ensured physical survival. Writing ensured cultural survival. The reed pen, dipped in ink of soot and ochre, scratched symbols across papyrus, These tools gave Egyptians the power to record harvests, prayers, laws, and stories. Scribes, carrying pallets of reed brushes and pigment, were seen as near. Their tools preserved memory, turning fleeting moments into lasting knowledge. In their hands, even the humblest pen became a tool of immortality. Musical tools were not only for survival, but for joy. Flutes of reed, harps strung with sinew, and drums made of stretched hide filled the air with rhythm. Music eased labor, celebrated festivals, and soothed sorrow. In temples, instruments were tools of worship, carrying prayers skyward. In villages, they were tools of togetherness, their sounds binding families in laughter and song. Even in survival, Egyptians found space for beauty, crafting tools not just of necessity, but of delight. The blacksmith and the firet. The heart of many crafts stood the blacksmith. His forge glowed with coals, his hammer rang against metal, shaping copper and bronze into blades, chisels, and ornaments. The smith's work was dangerous, his body scarred by sparks and heat, yet his skill elevated survival into mastery. Each tool he forged carried within it the fire of endurance. A farmer's sickle, a soldier's blade, a carpenter's chisel, all were born in his hands. Without him, survival faltered. With him, Egypt thrived. The intertwining of craft and spirit in Egypt. Even the simplest tool carried spiritual meaning. Amulets were carved with care, their shapes believed to guard against evil. Scarabs, symbols of rebirth, were worn as charms. Craftsmen invoked Ptah, the god of creation, as they worked, believing their skill a divine gift. Thus, crafts were not only practical, they were sacred. To weave a basket, carve a tool, or shape a jar was to participate in the eternal rhythm of life and worship. Closing reflection. The survival of ancient Egypt was not only written in the Nile's floods or in the pharaoh's decrees, it was written in the hands of craftsmen, in the silent labor of farmers, in the rhythm of hammer, chisel, and reed. Every tool was a story, every craft a prayer, and every invention, however humble, was a testament to human resilience. Through these tools, the Egyptians did more than endure the desert, they transformed it, leaving behind a civilization whose echoes still ring today. Life against the desert in Egypt, survival was not only about food and water, it was about protection. The desert was relentless, scorching sun by day, biting cold by night, sandstorms that blinded the eyes and stripped the skin raw. To endure, Egyptians wove their resilience into fabric, stone, and shelter. Clothing and homes were not luxuries, they were shields, as necessary as bread or grain. Without them, the harsh land would consume even the strongest. Linen, the fabric of survival. Egypt's great gift for clothing was linen, woven from the flax plant that thrived along the Nile. Farmers harvested its stalks, softened them in water, and beat the fibers until they were pliable threads. Women then wove these threads on looms, their hands turning plant into fabric. Linen was light and breathable, perfect for the desert heat. Men wore simple kilts, tied at the waist. Women draped long gowns over their bodies, fastened with beads or sashes. Children often wore little or nothing until older years. Even pharaohs, in all their splendor, wrapped themselves in linen. For peasants it was rough and plain. For nobles it was fine, sheer, and bleached to dazzling white. Yet in all its forms, linen was the same gift, a barrier against the sun, a comfort in the heat, footwear and protection. The desert ground burned hot under the sun, rough with stone and thorn. To walk it barefoot was to suffer. Sandals of woven reeds or leather became essential. Peasants often went barefoot in daily work, saving sandals for journeys or harsh ground. Nobles and priests wore decorated footwear, sometimes dyed or adorned with beads, but all knew their value. Shoes were not vanity, but defense. Shelter of clay and reed for the Egyptian peasant. Home was a refuge of mud brick. Nile mud, mixed with straw, was shaped into bricks, left to bake beneath the sun. These bricks, stacked and mortared with more mud, formed walls strong enough to stand against time. Roofs were flat, supported by palm beams, often layered with reed mats. Homes were small, cool inside, their windows narrow slits to keep out the sun. Inside, floors were swept with sand or clay, walls plastered smooth. Simple mats and stools served as furniture. Though humble, these homes were fortresses, places where families rested safe from the desert's cruelty. Homes of the wealthy nobles and high officials lived in larger estates. Their mud brick homes expanded into spacious halls and courtyards. These houses had multiple rooms, storerooms, and even pools lined with lotus, cooling the air with their presence. Walls were painted with bright colors, scenes of gardens, birds, and flowing water, vision of paradise in the midst of the desert. Servants moved through these halls, but even in grandeur, the materials were the same: mud brick, reed, clay. No one, not even the rich, could escape the desert's embrace. They could only soften it with abundance. Protection from the sunshade was survival. Villages were built with narrow streets to block direct sunlight. Trees were planted where possible, their shadows treasured. Head coverings were common: simple cloth wraps for peasants, elaborate headdresses for nobles. Children played under the shade of reed mats stretched across yards. Every patch of coolness was a sanctuary. For workers in the fields, shade was rare. They labored bare-chested, their skin darkened by the sun, their heads wrapped in linen cloths soaked in water. This simple trick gave them hours of relief before drying again in the heat. Night and cold. The desert did not only scorch, it froze. Nights brought sharp winds and cold air that crept through walls. Families wrapped themselves in thicker linens, in blankets of wool traded from herders. Fires were kindled in clay braziers, their glow filling homes with warmth. Peasants huddled together on mats for heat, while nobles enjoyed cushioned beds and furs. Yet all knew the same truth: survival demanded endurance of opposites. The burning day, the freezing night, ornament and identity. Though clothing began as protection, it soon became identity. The linen gown of a noblewoman shimmered with beads of turquoise and lapis lazuli. A priest's kilt was starched and pleated, a symbol of purity. Soldiers wore leather straps across their chests, their armor simple but practical. Even peasants added touches of beauty: necklaces of shells or faience beads, bracelets of woven fiber. Such adornments lifted spirits, turning mere survival into dignity. Cosmetics, too, were protection. Kohl painted around the eyes was not only decoration, it shielded against glare, reduced infection, and carried spiritual power. Thus, even the simplest gesture of beauty was tied to endurance. Defense against sandstorms. Few dangers were as feared as the Khamsin, the hot desert winds that whipped sand into storms. These storms choked breath, blinded eyes, and scoured skin. Families prepared by sealing homes with reed mats pressed against doorways. Those caught outside wrapped their heads tightly in linen, covering nose and mouth. Sandstorm stories pass from parent to child, reminders of nature's ferocity. For peasants, storms meant days of disrupted work and lost harvest. For travelers, they meant death if shelter could not be found. Yet again, linen and mud brick stood as silent allies against nature's fury. Community and shelter. Egyptian villages were built close, homes pressed together to form walls of defense against both heat and intruders. Shared courtyards gave shade, wells gave water, and neighbors gave security. In these clusters, survival became communal. One family's reed mat might shade another. One family's fire warmed a neighbor. Peasants learned that survival was not only individual but collective. Every shelter, a link in the chain of endurance. Sacred clothing and shelter. The line between the practical and the sacred was thin. Priests wore white linen as symbols of purity, untouched by dye or ornament. Pharaohs donned crowns and robes that embodied divine rule, their clothing becoming an extension of their authority. Temples themselves were shelters, vast structures of stone where the divine was protected from sun and storm. Within, priests performed rituals, shielded from the desert's chaos, offering prayers for the survival of all Egypt. Even tombs reflected this theme. The dead were wrapped in linen, placed in chambers meant to shelter them for eternity. The same fabric that shielded the living shielded the soul in its journey beyond. Closing reflection in the endless struggle between human frailty and desert power. Egyptians found resilience in fabric, clay, and stone. A kilt of linen, a sandal of reed, a house of mud brick. Each was simple, yet together they became civilization's alma. These protections did more than keep bodies alive. They preserved identity, dignity, and hope. In every garment worn, in every home built, Egyptians declared to the desert, "We will not be undone. We will endure." Survival beyond the physical food, water, and shelter kept the body alive. But for the Egyptians, survival was never only about the body. It was also about the spirit. The harsh desert test is not just flesh, but hope. And religion became the shield of the soul. Festivals, rituals, and ceremonies gave rhythm to life. They offered moments of joy in hardship, unity in fear, and meaning in struggle. In their sacred gatherings, peasants and nobles alike remembered why they endured. The gods as protectors to an Egyptian peasant. The gods were not distant, they walked beside them, breathed in the Nile's waters, and burned in the desert sun. Every task was tied to divinity. Planting crops was an offering to Osiris, drawing water was a gift from Hapi, and the rising sun itself was Ra's daily triumph. Faith was survival. To believe the gods guided and protected was to find courage against hunger and drought. Festivals of the Nile. When the inundation came, Egyptians celebrated with joy. Entire villages gathered along the riverbanks, throwing garlands of lotus into the water, singing hymns to Hapi, the god of the flood. Children splashed in the rising water, while priests chanted blessings. Families shared feasts, drinking beer brewed from the fresh barley of the previous harvest. These festivals were not only thanks, but also hope that the flood would rise again next year, that Egypt would remain green amidst the desert. For peasants, these gatherings were more than religious, they were respite from labor. Days when laughter returned, when even hunger seemed distant. The Opet festival in Thebes. One of the grandest festivals was Opet, a celebration of renewal. Statues of Amen, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from Karnak to Luxor in great processions, their gilded barges floating along the Nile. Crowds lined the banks, cheering as priests sang hymns. Music filled the air, with flutes, drums, and sistrums shaking in rhythm. Food and drink were handed out freely, and for days, the city transformed into a place of joy. For peasants, such festivals were glimpses of abundance, rare chances to eat well, to dance, to feel the gods' presence in tangible form. In those moments, survival felt less like struggle and more like celebration. Rituals of daily life beyond grand festivals. Rituals filled the ordinary days of Egyptians. Each morning, peasants poured libations of water to honor the gods, even if only a few drops from their jars. Farmers placed small offerings of bread or beer in fields, asking for protection over their crops. Mothers tied amulets around their children's neck, scarabs for rebirth, the eye of Horus for protection, the figure of Toret to guard against sickness. These acts carried faith into daily survival, weaving hope into every breath. Music and dance as rituals were not only spoken prayers, but embodied in sound and movement. Women shook sistrums, rattles of bronze and red, believed to please Hathor, goddess of joy and love. Dancers spun in circles, their arms lifted skyward, imitating the motions of creation. Even in villages, music was constant, drums of stretched hide, flutes carved from reeds, voices lifted in chant. The desert may have been silent, but Egypt was not. Faith filled the air with song, rituals of death and continuity to Egyptians. Survival was not limited to this life, it stretched into the afterlife. Rituals of death were as essential as rituals of harvest. Families saved not only for bread and beer in life, but also for offerings in death, ensuring their loved ones would eat and drink in eternity. Even the poorest peasants buried their dead with small amulets or simple jars of food. For them, it was an act of love, a promise that death was not an end but a passage. The grand tombs of pharaohs echoed this belief on a monumental scale, yet the essence was the same: a ritual of survival beyond the grave. Collective unity in worship festas also tied communities together. In villages, men and women gathered in temples, chanting hymns as one voice. These acts created solidarity, reminding peasants they were not alone in their struggle. A poor harvest felt less unbearable when the community came together to pray. A storm felt less frightening when songs rose in unison. Faith transformed loneliness into unity. Magic in rituals. Egyptian religion blurred the line between prayer and magic. Rituals often included incantations, protective spells, and charms inscribed on papyrus. To recite a name, to draw a symbol, to whisper a phrase, these were not superstitions but weapons against chaos. For peasants, these rituals were as real as tools. A charm of the Eye of Horus hung over a doorway was protection as vital as the mud brick itself. Survival through joy. Perhaps most importantly, festivals gave peasants joy. In a world of toil and danger, days of celebration were lifelines for the soul. Music, laughter, and shared meals reminded Egyptians that life, though fragile, could also be sweet. They danced not only for the gods but for themselves, for the simple human need to rejoice, to breathe, to remember that endurance was not only suffering but also living. closing, reflection, festivals and rituals were not distractions from survival, they were its foundation. They gave peasants the strength to rise with the sun, to work in the fields, to endure the desert's cruelty. In every prayer whispered at dawn, in every festival song, in every charm tied around a child's neck, the Egyptians declared their resilience. Faith was their fire, rituals were their shield, and joy was their victory over despair. The family as the first shelter in Egypt's desert world, survival began, not in temples or palaces, but in the family. For peasants, kinship was the first line of defense against hunger, sickness, and despair. Families shared food, work, and protection. Alone, a peasant could not endure, but within a family, burdens were divided, and hope multiplied. Children learned early that survival was a collective effort. They fetched water from the Nile, carried baskets of reeds, or scared birds away from crops. Every hand, no matter how small, had its place. The role of parents' fathers guided families through labor in the fields. They rose at dawn, led oxen to plows and carried baskets of grain. Yet their role was not only work, they were also guardians, teachers, and protectors. Mothers carried equal weight. They ground grain into flour, brewed beer, baked bread, and mended clothes. They tended wounds with herbs, soothed children with songs, and wove baskets for the household. Their wisdom, passed down from generations, was as vital as any tool. The balance between mother and father reflected the balance Egyptians saw in their universe. Both halves, necessary, neither diminished. Childhood in the village. Children grew in the warmth of community. They played with toys of clay and wood, small dolls, carved animals, miniature boats, yet their play also prepared them for survival. Girls imitated their mothers, pretending to grind grain or weave linen. Boys followed their fathers into fields, carrying tiny baskets, learning the rhythm of labor. Childhood was brief. By adolescence, children were workers, their hands hardened, their backs bent. Yet in their laughter and games, families found light. Reminders that joy still had a place even in hardship. Kinship, beyond blood. Kinship in Egypt extended beyond blood. Neighbors acted as family, bound by shared work and shared risks. During harvest, villagers worked together, reaping and carrying grain in groups. When storms damaged homes, neighbors rebuilt walls side by side. By marriage too was not only union of two people but of two families. Bonds of kinship expanded, weaving villages into tight webs of trust. Betrayal was rare, for in betrayal lay death. Loyalty was survival. Elders and ancestors' elders held deep respect in Egyptian life. Their words guided decisions, their stories preserved memory. Families listened as elders told of floods past, of droughts endured, of lessons carved in hardship. Their wisdom was survival written not on papyrus but in memory. Ancestors, too, lived within families. Offerings were placed at small shrines in homes, jars of beer and bread left for those who had gone before. The dead were not forgotten, they were companions, protectors, threads in the fabric of survival. Marriage and unity. Marriage was practical as well as emotional. A partner meant shared labor, children for the future, and security in old age. Love poems survive on papyrus, showing tenderness and passion, but beneath them lay necessity. To marry was to survive. Couples built homes together, raising children who would, in turn, support them. Families were not isolated, they were circles, each generation holding the next, each bound to survival's chain. Festivals within families. Beyond the great festivals of temples, families celebrated their own small feasts. At harvest's end, households shared bread and beer, thanking both gods and one another. Weddings filled villages with music, neighbors crowding together to bless the couple. Births were marked with laughter, and even funerals, though sorrowful, were communal moments where the living found strength in gathering. These families entered rituals stitched resilience into daily life. They reminded Egyptians that survival was not only a struggle against nature, but also a celebration of togetherness, that bonds of labor fields could not be tilled by one man alone. Irrigation ditches demanded groups of workers, their hands digging side by side in the mud. Harvest required dozens of backs bent beneath the sun, reaping grain in unison. Families pooled their labor, and neighbors became extensions of kin. Even in building homes, families and neighbors cooperated. Mud brick walls rose faster when many hands shaped and stacked them. Thus, every dwelling, every harvest, every loaf of bread bore the fingerprints of collective effort. Care in illness and age. When sickness struck, families became healers. Mothers brewed herbs, fathers fetched water, Children kept fires lit. Neighbors visited with jars of honey or figs, offerings of comfort and solidarity. Elders, when no longer able to labor, were not cast aside but cherished. Their stories, their presence, their memory of floods and droughts carried equal weight to physical work. They sat at doorways, watching grandchildren play, their wisdom silently guiding the village. Stories and identity at night. When fields lay silent and fires glowed, families gathered to tell stories, tales of gods and pharaohs, of floods and famine, of ancestors who endured impossible trials. These stories were not only entertainment, they were instruction, courage wrapped in memory. Children fell asleep to the rhythm of their parents' voices, their dreams shaped by lessons of survival and hope. In storytelling, families passed on not only knowledge, but identity. We are Egyptians. We endure together. Closing reflection. For Egypt's peasants, family was not an ornament of life. It was life itself. In bonds of blood and bonds of community, they found the strength to survive the desert, the flood, the storm, and the hunger. Every loaf shared, every wall raised, every story told was an act of resilience. Families were Egypt's true monuments, more enduring than stone. For, without them, no temple, no pyramid, no pharaoh would have survived the desert's test. The economy of survival in Egypt's villages. Coins did not yet jingle in purses, nor did peasants carry gold in their hands. The lifeblood of their economy was simpler. But a jar of beer could be exchanged for a basket of fish. A bundle of reeds might be traded for a clay pot. Trade was not only about wealth, it was survival. A farmer who grew barley depended on a potter for vessels, on a fisherman for protein, on a weaver for clothing. No family could endure alone. Their survival depended on exchange, a web of trust and need that bound communities together. Local barter at village markets, held in open courtyards or along the riverbank. Families gathered to trade. Women laid out baskets of dried figs. Men carried jars of beer. Children ran between stalls, clutching handfuls of onions or garlic. There was no coin to settle disputes, only bargaining. 3 loaves for your jar of honey, one might say. No, for loaves, came the reply. Hands gestured, voices rose, laughter followed. In the end, both sides left with what they needed. These markets were more than trade, they were gatherings of community, places where news spread, where songs were sung, where bonds deepened. Long-distance exchange, though villages bartered among themselves. Egypt as a whole thrived on long-distance trade. Donkey caravans carried goods across desert paths, their backs laden with jars of oil, baskets of grain, and rolls of linen. Boats sailed down the Nile, linking Upper and Lower Egypt in constant flow. Foreign trade brought treasures, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense and myrrh from Punt, copper from Sinai, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These luxuries adorned pharaohs and temples, but even peasants felt their presence in small ways. A copper tool passed down, a bead of turquoise gifted at a wedding. Trade linked Egypt not only to itself but to the wider world, stitching survival into a fabric larger than the Nile's banks. Scribes and records, though peasants bartered with words, officials measured with ink. Scribes recorded how much grain entered granaries, how many jars of beer were brewed, how much oil was pressed. Their records ensured fairness, or at least control. For pharaohs, trade was also a matter of power. Taxes were taken in grain, redistributed in rations, ensuring workers and soldiers remained loyal. The economy, at its heart, was as much political as practical. Temples, as centers of trade, temples were not only places of worship, they were centers of wealth. They owned land, managed granaries, and employed workers. Offerings to gods, grain, wine, oil flowed into temples, which in turn distributed them to priests, workers, and laborers. Thus, religion and trade intertwined. To offer at a temple was also to support an economic system that fed the community. Faith and survival moved hand in hand. The role of women and tradewomen were active participants in markets, bartering loaves of bread, jars of beer, or woven linen. Some women became skilled traders, known for their sharp bargaining. Their presence gave markets their lively rhythm, their laughter carrying across stalls. Children, too, learned early, watching their mothers trade, imitating their gestures. In markets, survival was taught not in scrolls but in the bivantek of daily life. Seasonal trade followed. The rhythm of the Nile. During inundation, when fields were underwater, farmers had time to weave baskets, make tools, and prepare goods for barter. Markets swelled with activity, stalls brimming with both necessity and novelty. When the floodwaters receded and planting began, trade slowed, but it never ceased. Villagers brought surplus onions, jars of preserved fish, or bundles of flax, trading for what their families lacked. The ebb and flow of markets mirrored the river itself, a constant pulse of exchange. Caravan journeys. For longer distances, caravans were lifelines. Donkeys trudged along desert roads, their bells tinkling as they carried jars of wine or baskets of grain to distant settlements. Guards walked beside, spears in hand. 4 bandits prowled these routes, eager to steal Egypt's wealth. Caravan leaders memorized oases, places of rest where water could be found. Without these waypoints, journeys were death sentences. Survival and trade demanded not only goods but knowledge of the deserts. Secrets. Foreign treasures, though peasants rarely saw them, foreign goods, shaped Egypt's identity. Incense from punt-filled temples with fragrance. Copper from Sinai became tools that eased labor. Lapis lazuli, bright as the sky, adorned jewelry buried with kings. To peasants, these goods trickled down in fragments, a bronze chisel that lasted generations, a bead worn proudly at a festival. Even the humblest family felt the reach of distant lands. The spirit of fairness. Barter relied on trust. There was no fixed currency, no scales at every stall. Instead, reputation guided trade. A man known for cheating would soon find no buyers. A woman praised for fairness drew customers like bees to honey. Thus, trade built not only wealth but community honor. To cheat was to betray survival itself. The pharaoh's hand, though barter thrived at village level. The pharaoh's authority touched all trade. Taxes collected in grain-filled state. These reserves fed workers building temples and pyramids, or soldiers guarding borders. Trade, in this sense, was not only survival for peasants, it was the foundation of empire. Without grain, there were no monuments, no armies, no pharaohs remembered in stone. Closing reflection. Trade and barter were not luxuries of wealth, they were lifelines. Every loaf exchanged, every jar traded, every caravan journeyed was a thread in the great web that held Egypt together. Through markets and caravans, Egyptians learned this simple truth: survival was never solitary. It was shared, it was exchanged, it was woven together in the hands of many. Companions in the desert in Egypt, animals were not simply creatures of the land, they were partners in survival. From the ox that pulled the plow to the cat that guarded the granary, every animal held a role in the daily struggle against the desert's harshness. Egyptians revered animals as sacred beings, often linking them to gods. Yet beyond their spiritual symbolism lay practical value: food, labor, protection, and companionship. Without animals, Egypt's endurance would have been impossible. Oxen and cattle. The ox was the farmer's most trusted ally. With wooden plows strapped to their shoulders, oxen turned silt-rich soil into fertile furrows. Their slow, steady strength multiplied human labor, transforming the Nile's gift into fields of grain. Cattle provided milk and meat, though peasants ate meat sparingly, often saving it for festivals. More often, cattle were symbols of wealth, counted as assets in scribes' records. A family with many cattle was secure. One without lived in constant uncertainty. Donkeys, carriers of burden. The humble donkey was indispensable. It carried sacks of grain, jars of water, baskets of figs. Donkeys trudged along village paths and desert roads, their braying a familiar sound in every settlement. For caravans, donkeys were lifelines. Laden with goods, they carried Egypt's wealth to distant markets, returning with treasures of foreign lands. Though often overlooked, their endurance made them the silent backbone of trade. Cats, guardians of grain. Few animals held as beloved a place as the cat. Sleek, agile, and watchful, cats hunted mice and rats that threatened grain stores. To a peasant, a cat was more than a pet, it was a protector of survival. So revered were cats that harming one, even by accident, was a grave offense. Temples honored Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of fertility and protection. Families cherished their feline companions, painting them on walls, burying them with care. In cats, Egyptians saw grace and divinity, but also a practical ally in guarding the harvest. Dogs, companions, and hunters' dogs were loyal companions, guarding homes and aiding in the hunt. Hunters relied on swift hounds to chase gazelle or flush birds from reeds. Families kept dogs not only for protection but for affection, their loyalty cherished as deeply as their usefulness. Burials of dogs have been found, adorned with collars, mourned by their owners. They were not mere beasts, they were family, Birds and falcons, ducks and pigeons filled Egyptian coops. They provided eggs, meat, and feathers for pillows. Children often tended flocks, guiding them to water, guarding them from predators. Birds also filled religious roles. The ibis, linked to Thoth, was seen as sacred. Yet in villages, geese honked in courtyards, a noisy reminder of survival's daily rhythm. Fish and the river's bounty, though not domesticated in the same way. Fish were vital. Nets, traps, and harpoons brought in tilapia, catfish, and eels, which were dried, salted, or eaten fresh. The Nile teemed with life, and peasants depended on its constant flow. Children learned to fish with simple lines, their laughter echoing across the banks. For many poor families, fish was the only meat they ever tasted outside festivals. Horses and chariots. Horses were not native to Egypt, but arrived later through trade and conquest. Once introduced, they transformed Egyptian life. Though peasants rarely saw them, horses became symbols of power. Pulling chariots of nobles and pharaohs, chariots thundered across battlefields, their speed unmatched. Yet, even in war, their presence shaped survival. Victories secured peace, and peace secured harvests. Horses, though rare for peasants, altered the destiny of the entire land. Camels, the desert ship's camels, came late to Egypt, but once they did, they proved invaluable. Able to carry heavy loads across vast deserts, they became the ultimate tool of survival for caravans. Their humps stored fat, their bodies endured heat, their sure steps crossed dunes, where donkeys faltered, though less common in the earliest periods. Camels eventually became essential for desert trade, linking Egypt to distant lands with reliability no other beast could match. Sacred animals beyond their practical uses. Animals were woven into Egypt's spiritual identity. Crocodiles, feared along the Nile, were honored as symbols of Sobek, a god of strength and fertility. Bulls represented APIs, embodiments of divine power, kept in sacred temples. Even beetles, humble scarabs, rolling balls of dung, became symbols of rebirth, worn as protective amulets. For Egyptians, animals were not separate from humans. They were kin, guardians, and reflections of divine order. Animal care and responsibility. Peasants cared for their animals with diligence, for survival depended on them. Cattle were sheltered in red pens, donkeys fed bundles of straw, cats cherished with affection. Shepherds watched goats and sheep graze along the Nile's edges, their flocks providing milk, wool, and occasional meat. Songs were sung to animals during labor. Farmers spoke softly to oxen pulling plows. Children patted donkeys on weary journeys. This bond was not sentiment alone, it was recognition of shared survival. Animals in art and memory. Tomb paintings teemed with images of animals. Cats beneath chairs, dogs leaping at birds, oxen pulling plows, geese in flight. These scenes were not decoration, they were records of life, promises that in the afterlife, animals would accompany the dead. Even the poorest hoped their afterlife would echo this bond. Fields with oxen to plow, cats to guard grain, fish swimming in endless rivers. Animals, like humans, were part of eternity. Closing reflection. In Egypt, animals were never just beasts of burden or sources of food. They were allies, companions, protectors, and symbols of divine power. Every loaf of bread owed its life to oxen that plowed. Every granary its safety to cats that prowled. Every family its laughter to dogs that guarded their homes. Survival was never human alone. It was shared, written in the footprints of animals across the Nile's banks. Stories as survival. For Egyptians, survival was not only about food, water, or shelter, it was also about memory. Knowledge preserved meant mistakes avoided, wisdom carried, and identity secured. In villages and temples alike, storytelling became as vital as bread. Stories bound families together, carried lessons across generations, and filled long desert nights with meaning. They were maps of experience, guiding Egyptians through hardship with courage and hope. The oral tradition, long before pens and papyrus, stories lived in the voices of elders, around fires or in cool courtyards. Grandfathers spoke of floods that were too high. Grandmothers told of years when crops withered. These tales were not mere entertainment, they were survival guides. Children listened, wide-eyed, learning when to plant, when to harvest, how to honor the gods, and how to endure hunger. Memory was the first library, carried not in scrolls but in hearts. The rise of the scribes. Yet Egypt gave birth to a greater gift. Writing, along the Nile, reeds of papyrus became pages, and reeds cut to brushes became pens. Scribes emerged, keepers of words, guardians of knowledge. To peasants, scribes seemed almost magical. They could capture speech and preserve it beyond time. Their hands carried not only laws and taxes but also prayers, poems, and medical remedies. The life of a scribe was different from the farmer or laborer. They studied in temple schools, learning thousands of symbols, practicing until their hands cramped. But their reward was prestige, for knowledge was power, and scribes were its gatekeepers. Knowledge of the Nile. Scribes recorded flood levels on Nile, harvest yields in ledgers, and temple offerings in scrolls. Their records provided patterns that guided survival. Families depended on their announcements. A high flood meant abundance, a low flood meant famine. Even peasants who could not read relied on scribes, their voices carrying knowledge into the fields. Scribes transformed the chaos of nature into information, allowing Egypt to prepare for hardship. Stories of the gods. Storytelling also connected humans to the divine. Myths explained the rising and setting of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the cycles of life and death. The story of Osiris, slain and resurrected, taught that death was not an end, but a passage. The daily journey of Ra across the sky gave courage to peasants who endured endless days of labor. These stories carried comfort. When the desert seemed merciless, myths reminded Egyptians they were part of a divine rhythm, their struggles reflections of cosmic order. Wisdom literature. Egyptian scribes also created wisdom texts, collections of advice for living well. Fathers wrote to sons, "Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge. Speak with the ignorant as with the wise. The limits of skill are never reached." Such teachings were copied for centuries, guiding not only elites but echoing into villages through recitation. They taught humility, patience, kindness, the virtues that strengthened survival in community. Practical knowledge. Not all knowledge was myth or philosophy. Papyrus scrolls preserved recipes for medicines, instructions for preserving food, even guides for building boats or crafting tools. The Ebers papyrus detailed hundreds of medical remedies: honey for wounds, garlic for infections, willow bark for pain. The Rind mathematical papyrus explained fractions, calculations for fields, and geometry for construction. For peasants, such knowledge was indirect, filtered through priests or healers, yet its impact was immense. Healthier bodies, stronger homes, fairer harvests. Scribes, as bridges. Scribes stood between the divine, the state, and the common people. They recorded taxes for Pharaoh, wrote hymns for gods, and sometimes even composed letters for peasants who could not write. Their work shaped every level of society. Though peasants often grumbled about taxes, they also respected the scribe's skill. He was both feared and admired, an ordinary man whose pen shaped destinies, entertainment and tales. Not all stories were solemn. Egyptians loved tales of wonder and humor. Scrolls tell of magical princes, animals who spoke, pharaohs who dreamed of gods. Some stories poked fun at authority, others offered comfort through fantasy. These tales echoed in villages, retold around fires, embroidered with each telling. For children, they were lullabies. For adults, reminders that laughter, too, was survival. The afterlife of knowledge in tombs. Scribes painted themselves with pens and palettes, certain that writing would follow them into eternity. They left behind scrolls filled with prayers and spells, ensuring the dead knew the words to pass into the afterlife. Knowledge was not only for life, it was for death as well. A torch to light the path beyond. Closing reflections. Storytelling and writing gave Egypt a memory that outlived generations. Through myths, wisdom texts, medical recipes, and mathematical formulas, they conquered time itself. For peasants, this knowledge was both distant and intimate. Distant in scrolls they could not read, intimate in stories told by elders, in guidance spoken by priests, in proverbs whispered at night. Egypt's survival was written not only in stone monuments but in words that carried hope, guidance, and resilience across centuries. The fragility of peace. Life in ancient Egypt often seemed serene. The Nile's rhythm, the field's abundance, the temple's grandeur. Yet beneath this order, danger always lurked. Neighboring tribes pressed against borders, bandits roamed deserts, and famine could drive desperate raids. Survival was never guaranteed. Peace had to be guarded, and security demanded sacrifice. For peasants, war meant not only battles fought by armies but also disruptions of life fields abandoned, taxes raised, sons conscripted, early defenses in the earliest dynasties. Villages built simple defenses, mud brick walls, watchtowers near river crossings, and wooden gates. Farmers themselves often stood guard. Weapons little more than staffs or stone blades. But as kingdoms grew, so did the scale of threats. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Narma created not only an empire, but also the need to defend its borders. The deserts to the east and west, the Sinai to the north, and Nubia to the south all posed challenges. The soldiers, like Egyptian soldiers, were often peasants called to arms. During times of war, men left fields behind, their families shouldering the burden of crops. They trained with spears, shields, and later with bronze weapons. For some, military service offered opportunity. Victories brought spoils, cattle, grain, sometimes even land. Service could elevate a man, granting him honor and a place in Pharaoh's favor. Yet the risks were immense. Many never returned, their families left vulnerable. The role of Pharaoh was not only ruler but also protector. He was depicted smiting enemies, standing tall with mace raised, trampling foes beneath his sandals. These images carved in temples were not mere art, they were promises. Pharaoh embodied Egypt's defense, ensuring the balance of order, triumphed over chaos. To peasants, this symbolism mattered. When famine threatened or invaders pressed, they looked to Pharaoh not only as king but as shield. His strength meant their survival. Fortresses and borderlands. As Egypt expanded, it built fortresses to guard trade routes and resources. In Nubia, great mud brick forts rose along the Nile, controlling gold mines and protecting caravans. In the Delta, watchposts scanned for sea raiders. These fortresses became hubs of survival. Garrisons protected villagers, traders found safe passage, and officials collected supplies. For peasants near borders, life revolved around these stronghold sources of both security and taxation. Weapons of war. Egyptian armies adapted over centuries. Early weapons were simple copper axes, wooden spears, stone-tipped arrows. Over time, bronze swords, composite bows, and eventually, chariots transformed warfare. The introduction of the horse and chariot during the Second Intermediate Period was revolutionary. Swift, mobile, deadly, chariots carried archers who rained arrows upon foes. They became symbols of elite power, feared across the region. Yet for peasants, these innovations were victories brought safety, but defeats brought devastation. Burned villages, stolen harvests, enslaved kin. Life during wartime. For peasants, war meant uncertainty. Fields were left unplowed, harvests went uncollected, and families endured hunger while men marched. Armies consumed vast supplies, and villages often had to surrender grain, cattle, or tools to support campaigns. Women and elders held households together. They guarded children, managed animals, and prayed for safe returns. Songs of mourning and hope echoed across the Nile, blending sorrow with resilience. Raiders and bandits. Not all threats came from distant armies. Desert raiders and bandits targeted caravans and border villages. They stole livestock, kidnapped peasants, and disrupted trade. Guards patrolled roads, and peasants sometimes formed militias, carrying clubs and spears to protect their kin. Such violence shaped Egyptian identity. The line between chaos and order was fragile, and every peasant knew survival depended on vigilance, alliances, and trade. Not every encounter with foreigners was war. Egypt also built alliances, exchanged gifts, and engaged in diplomacy. Tribute from Nubia, cedarwood from Lebanon, and trade with the Levant enriched Egypt. Peaceful exchange strengthened survival, showing that sometimes wisdom was mightier than the sword. Still, alliances were fragile. A famine in one land could spark raids in another, and promises of peace could dissolve into ambushes. Egyptians learned to balance diplomacy with readiness for war. The emotional toll beyond physical danger. War carried emotional burdens. Families grieved sons lost in distant lands. Survivors returned scarred, their memories heavy with battle. Yet villages honored their sacrifices, retelling their courage in stories, weaving their names into prayers. Even myths reflected this struggle. Gods fought eternal battles against chaos, their victories echoing human struggles. Egyptians found solace in these parallels, believing their endurance mirrored divine resilience. Victories and empire. When Egypt triumphed, Prosperity followed. Conquests secured gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, horses from Asia. Victorious armies returned with spoils, enriching temples and granaries. Pharaoh's image as protector grew, inspiring pride, yet empire came at a cost. Expansion meant more borders to defend, more taxes to collect, more lives spent in battle. For peasants, victories brought both hope and burden, the eternal struggle in the end. Egypt's survival was a balance between war and peace. Defense was not only armies and walls, but also courage in the hearts of peasants, loyalty to Pharaoh, and trust in Mat's order. War shaped Egypt's destiny, but resilience sustained it. Even in ruins, villages rebuilt. Even in loss, families endured. Egypt's greatness lay not only in monuments or armies, but in the quiet strength of its people, who carried on despite turmoil. Closing reflection. Defense was not only about protecting borders, it was about protecting life itself. Pharaohs, soldiers, scribes, peasants, and even children all played roles in this struggle. Egypt survived because it remembered that survival was collective. When one fell, another rose. When one field was burned, another was planted. When one family grieved, another gave hope. This eternal resilience was Egypt's true weapon, stronger than swords, greater than chariots, more lasting than any fortress. Joy amid hardship. Life in Egypt was not only toil and survival. Amid famine, labor, and war, people sought joy. Festivals brought laughter, music, and dancing that lifted spirits and reminded peasants they were more than laborers, they were part of a living, divine rhythm. Festivals were both religious and social. They honored gods, marked seasons, and offered a chance to celebrate survival itself. For peasants, they were moments of escape, days when burdens were set aside, when hunger eased in shared feasts, when songs replaced sighs. The calendar of festivals. Egypt's calendar was filled with holy days. Some celebrated the flooding of the Nile, others honored gods like Osiris, Haf, or Amen. Each festival carried its own rituals, processions, offerings, music, and performances. The Opet festival in Thebes was among the grandest. Statues of Amen, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by music and feasting. Even peasants, far from Thebes, heard tales of its splendor, inspiring pride in their faith. Local festivals, too, filled villages with joy, simple gatherings with dancing, bread, and beer. Every celebration, great or small, reminded Egyptians they were part of a larger story. Music and dance music filled Egyptian festivals with life. Harps, flutes, drums, and sistrums created rhythms that echoed across villages. Songs honored gods, celebrated love, or simply encouraged dancing. Dancers spun in flowing linen, their movements graceful yet powerful. Acrobats entertained crowds, while children clapped and laughed. For peasants, these sounds were medicine, soothing wounds of labor and hunger. Even funerals contained music, blending grief with hope. Egyptians believed that song connected humans to gods, making every melody a prayer. Food and feasting festivals were rare chances for peasants to enjoy abundance. Temples distributed bread, beer, and sometimes meat. Families shared what little they had, creating communal joy. Beer flowed freely, made from barley, thick and nourishing. Bread came in many forms, flat, round, even sweetened with honey. Occasionally, wealthier villagers provided goats or fish for roasting. For many, these meals were sacred. They reminded people that survival was not only about endurance but also about sharing blessings. The festival of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, was celebrated with particular delight. Her festivals were filled with dancing, intoxication, and laughter. Women adorned themselves with jewelry, men drank deeply, and music lasted until dawn. Peasants embraced these moments as escapes from hardship. In Hathor's joy, they found relief from hunger and fear, believing laughter itself was divine. Community bonds. Festivals strengthened bonds between neighbors. Disputes were set aside, families reunited, strangers became friends. Joy was contagious, weaving unity into the fabric of villages. For children, festivals created memories that outlasted famine. For elders, they were proof that life's beauty endured despite hardship. For all, they were a reminder. Survival was not only about struggle, it was also about joy. Processions and sacred images. One of the most magical sights during festivals was the procession of gods. Priests carried statues of deities on sacred barks, adorned with gold and flowers. Crowds gathered, chanting hymns, watching as the gods were paraded through streets or along the Nile in boats. For peasants, seeing the gods leave their temples was a powerful moment. It was as if the divine stepped into their world, blessing fields, homes, and children with presents. Drama and ritual festivals often included dramatic reenactments of myths. The story of Osiris and Isis was acted out, teaching peasants about death, rebirth, and hope. These performances blended religion and theater, drawing crowds into sacred stories. Such plays were more than entertainment, they were lessons in survival. Watching Osiris rise from death reassured Egyptians that their own struggles, too, were part of a cycle where life triumphed over hardship. Healing and renewal. Many festivals were tied to healing. Priests offered prayers, burned incense, and poured libations, asking gods to cure sickness or protect harvests. Sacred water was sprinkled on crowds, amulets were sold, and chants promised safety. For peasants, these moments brought comfort. Even if hunger lingered, the belief in divine care gave strength. Faith itself became medicine. Role of women's festivals offered women visibility, often hidden in daily toil. Women danced in honor of Hathor, played sistrums in temples, and led songs. They became central to celebrations of fertility and love, embodying the goddess's spirit. Through music and joy, women expressed resilience, showing that survival was not only physical but emotional and spiritual. Beer and ecstasy. Egyptian festivals were famously lively. Beer was poured in abundance, sometimes leading to ecstasy or trance-like states. This intoxication was not frowned upon but seen as a sacred act, connecting humans to Hathor's joy. Drunkenness erased fear, grief, and hunger, if only for a night. In laughter and song, peasants reclaimed their humanity, proving they were not only laborers but celebrants of life. The aftertaste of joy. When festivals ended, peasants returned to toil. Fields awaited plowing, granaries awaited filling. Yet memories of music, food, and laughter lingered. These memories gave strength, reminding Egyptians that even in the harsh desert, life had beauty worth cherishing. Festivals were survival in their purest form, not merely enduring life, but celebrating it. Closing reflection. Amid famine, labor, and war, Egyptians found ways to laugh, dance, and feast. Festivals were not distractions, they were lifelines. They reminded Egyptians that they were more than their struggles, that joy itself was divine, that survival meant not only enduring but celebrating. In their music, their feasts, their laughter, Egyptians discovered resilience, and in their joy, they found the strength to endure another year in the harsh desert. The fragility of health. In the harsh desert climate, health was fragile. The Nile gave life, but it also carried risks. Parasites in water, mosquitoes in the marshes, crocodiles lurking in shallows. Fields fed the people but bent their backs with labor, leaving bodies aching and worn. For peasants, sickness could mean disaster. A farmer too weak to work left his family hungry. A child's fever threatened the future of a household. Healing, therefore, was as essential to survival as food or water. Healers of the village. Most Egyptians relied first on village healers, wise women and men who used herbs, prayers, and charms. They passed knowledge through generations, blending observation with faith. Garlic was given for coughs, honey for wounds, and onions to strengthen the body. Incantations were whispered, while poultices were applied, for sickness was seen not only as physical but spiritual. Evil spirits, curses, or angered gods could bring illness, and healing required both medicine and ritual. The priests of Sekhmet. In temples, healing was a sacred duty. Priests of Sekhmet, goddess of war and plague, specialized in curing disease. They believed sickness was punishment or imbalance, and through rituals, prayers, and offerings, they sought forgiveness from the gods. Amulets, shaped like the eye of Horus or scarabs, were given as protection. Sacred words were spoken to drive away spirits of illness. For peasants, visiting temple healers was both a medical act and an act of faith. Medical texts. Knowledge was also preserved in papyri, written by scribes and doctors. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents, contained over 700 remedies. It listed treatments for stomach pain, burns, fractures, and infections. The Edwin Smith Papyrus was remarkable for its practical detail. It described surgeries, head injuries, and methods of stitching wounds. It showed that Egyptian doctors could distinguish between treatable and untreatable conditions, sign of advanced knowledge. Everyday remedies, common remedies filled daily life. Bread mold was sometimes applied to wounds, unknowingly using penicillin-like effects. Honey, with natural antibacterial properties, was spread on cuts. Willow bark relieved pain, much like modern aspirin. For stomach troubles, herbs like cumin and coriander were used. For fevers, cool compresses and prayers were combined. For broken bones, splints of wood and linen were tied, showing surprising medical skill. Peasants may not have read these papyri, but they benefited from the traditions passed down through healers and doctors who learned from them. Magic and medicine together. Egyptian healing never separated the physical from the spiritual. Medicine and magic worked side by side. A doctor might prescribe herbs while chanting a spell to banish demons of sickness. This combination gave comfort to patients. Even if the cure failed, the rituals reassured them that every power, human and divine, was being used to help. Surgeons and practical skill. Among Egypt's doctors were skilled surgeons. They set broken bones, drained abscesses, stitched cuts, and even performed rudimentary brain surgery. Evidence from mummies shows healed fractures, proving that treatments often worked. Surgery was performed with bronze knives, obsidian blades, and delicate instruments of copper. Linen bandages wrapped wounds, while oils soothed pain. These doctors were respected, though many procedures remained risky. For peasants, such advanced care was rare, but soldiers injured in battle or workers harmed during construction sometimes benefited from these skills. The role of women too played important roles in healing. Midwives guided childbirth, offered herbs for easing pain, and protected mothers with prayers to Toret, the goddess of fertility. Female healers cared for children, treating fevers and coughs with remedies from kitchens and fields. Though often overlooked, women were the first doctors in most households, blending instinct, tradition, and devotion to preserve life. Veterinary medicine, since animals were vital for survival. Egyptians also cared for their health. Oxen were treated for hoof rot, donkeys for saddle sores, cats for infections. Simple remedies, poultices, and prayers were applied to keep animals strong. Priests of Hathor sometimes healed cattle, believing the goddess's blessing extended to beasts as well as humans. This veterinary care protected food supplies and labor, showing the deep bond between people and animals. Dreams and healing. Egyptians also believed dreams revealed cures. A sick person might sleep in a temple, hoping a god would appear with guidance. Priests interpreted these dreams, prescribing remedies or rituals based on visions. For peasants, this practice gave hope when medicine seemed powerless. It reassured them that divine compassion watched over human suffering. Death and acceptance. Not every illness could be cured. Some diseases baffled even the wisest doctors. In such cases, Egyptians turned to comfort, incense for pain, prayers for peace, and rituals for safe passage into the afterlife. Death was not feared as annihilation but accepted as transition. Healing, therefore, was not only about prolonging life but ensuring dignity in death. Legacy of Egyptian medicine. The wisdom of Egyptian doctors influenced later civilizations. Greeks studied their texts, Romans adopted their remedies, and even today, honey, garlic, and willow bark echo in modern medicine. For peasants, the legacy was simpler. A poultice of herbs, a prayer whispered in the night, a healer's touch, a mother's lullaby. These small acts sustained them across centuries. Closing reflection. Medicine in Egypt was never separate from survival. It was survival itself. From the village healer to the temple priest, from the scribe copying remedies to the mother soothing her child, every act of healing mattered. Egypt endured not only because of its fields and rivers, but because of its care for the fragile human body. Its wisdom reminds us that survival is not only about strength but compassion, knowledge, and faith. The gift of birth in the desert's harshness. Every child born was a blessing. Families rejoiced at new life, offering prayers to Toret, the goddess of childbirth, and Base, the protector of mothers and infants. Yet childbirth was risky. Without modern medicine, mothers and babies often faced danger. Midwives guided labor, using herbs for pain and prayers for safety. When a child's cry filled a home, it was not only joy but proof of survival. Early years children grew up close to nature. They played along the Nile's banks, splashing in water, chasing fish, or shaping mud into toys. Simple dolls, carved animals, or balls made of papyrus filled their games. Yet play was also learning. Boys practiced throwing sticks at birds. Girls learned to grind grain or weave mats. These games prepared them for adult roles, teaching survival through imitation. Family bonds. Family was the heart of Egyptian survival. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes extended relatives lived together under one roof. Elders told stories, mothers taught household skills, fathers guided farming or craft. Respect for parents was a sacred duty. In wisdom texts, sons were urged, "Listen to your mother as she bore you. Do not forget her who gave you life." Family ties gave emotional and practical strength in times of famine or war. Education of the elite. While most peasant children learned skills at home, some boys, especially those of scribes or officials, attended schools. In temple courtyards, they sat on mats, copying hieroglyphs onto shards of pottery. The training was harsh. Teachers enforced discipline with strictness, sometimes even beatings, yet the reward was immense. Literacy, respect, and the possibility of rising above peasant life. Girls rarely attended these schools, but some daughters of nobles and priestesses learned to read and write, preserving knowledge across generations. Learning trades. For most children, education meant apprenticeship. Boys followed fathers into fields, workshops, or markets. They learned to plow, fish, build boats, or craft tools. Girls followed mothers in grinding flour, weaving linen, brewing beer, or caring for animals. Skills were passed by demonstration, hands guiding hands. In this way, knowledge survived, not in scrolls but in muscle memory, carried across centuries. Discipline and morality. Egyptian families valued obedience and respect. Children were taught to honor elders, help in fields, and avoid arrogance. Wisdom texts urged humility. Do not speak too much. Listen first. Discipline could be strict, but love was present. Parents praised good behavior, rewarded diligence, and guided with patience. Children's laughter filled villages, but so did their chores. Survival meant all hands, even small ones, contributed. Games and joy. Despite hardships, Egyptian children found joy in games. They played tug of war with papyrus ropes, spun wooden tops, and swam in the Nile's cool waters. Boys wrestled on sandy banks, while girls skipped with braided cords. Pets were common companions. Dogs guarded children at play, cats chased birds, monkeys were trained to mimic tricks. These bonds brought laughter, easing the weight of desert life. Clothing and appearance. Children wore little in early years, the hot climate needing no heavy dress. As they grew, simple linen kilts or dresses were given, often hand-me-downs from elders. Shaved heads kept lice away. Those side locks of hair symbolized youth. Jewelry adorned even poor children. Beads of clay, shells, or amulets in the shape of scarabs or eyes of Horus were worn for protection, believed to guard them from sickness and evil spirits. Coming of age. As children matured, they took on greater responsibilities. Boys might herd goats, repair tools, or join fathers in fishing. Girls spun thread, prepared meals, or fetched water. By adolescence, they were no longer children but workers in the family economy. Marriages often came early, especially for girls, binding families and ensuring survival of new generations. Education in morals and religion. Children were taught respect for the gods from their earliest days. Festivals introduced them to myths, while home altars reminded them of divine presence. Stories of Osiris, Isis, and Horus shaped their understanding of right and wrong. They learned virtues, honesty, loyalty, generosity. Survival was not only physical but moral. Those who lived with Mat, the principle of order, believed they would prosper in life and after death. Struggles of childhood. Childhood in Egypt was not without pain. Many children died young, taken by fevers, infections, or hunger. Parents grieved, but faith in the afterlife softened sorrow. They believed lost children would live eternally in fields of plenty, free of suffering. This faith gave families strength to endure loss, reminding them that every child, however brief their life, was part of eternity. Closing reflection. In Egypt, childhood was both fragile and precious. Families celebrated new life, taught survival through play and work, and wove joy into the fabric of hardship. Children carried Egypt's future, not only in their hands, but in their laughter, their learning, and their loyalty to family and gods. Their survival ensured Egypt's survival, binding past, present, and future into one unbroken chain. The rhythm of labor work defined Egyptian life. From sunrise to sunset, peasants bent their backs in fields, craftsmen shaped tools and jewelry, and laborers hauled stones for temples and tombs. Labor was survival, but it was also pride. Each task, no matter how small, built the strength of Egypt itself. The desert was merciless, and the Nile unpredictable, yet through toil, Egyptians turned hardship into prosperity. Work was their greatest offering to gods, Pharaoh, and family. Farmers. The lifeblood of Egypt. Farmers formed the largest group in Egypt. They plowed with wooden tools drawn by oxen, planted barley and wheat by hand, and prayed for Nile floods to nourish their fields. Farming was grueling. The sun burned, backs ached, and hands blistered. Yet without farmers, no one survived. Pharaohs, priests, and nobles depended on their harvests. Farmers endured, knowing their labor fed not only their children but the kingdom itself. They paid taxes in grain, often surrendering much of their yield. Still, they found pride in the fertility of the Nile, seeing themselves as partners with the river in sustaining Egypt. Craftsmen, masters of skill in villages and cities. Craftsmen shaped Egypt's beauty. Potters spun clay into jars. Weavers turned flax into linen. Metalworkers forged copper tools, and carpenters carved furniture. Their work carried artistry beyond function. Painted pottery, inlaid jewelry, and decorated coffins reflected not only utility but imagination. Even simple homes bore the marks of craftsmanship. Woven mats, carved wooden spoons, dyed cloth. Craftsmen formed guilds, working in groups, teaching apprentices. Their skill brought them respect, though wealth remained modest. For peasants, their crafts were essential: jars to store grain, baskets to carry fish, sandals for weary feet. Laborers, builders of monuments. Perhaps the most grueling work was that of laborers. They hauled stones, dug canals, and built temples and pyramids. Contrary to myths of slaves, most were free peasants conscripted for state projects. Serving part of the year, they lived in workers' villages, provided with food, beer, and shelter. Work was harsh, heavy blocks, long hours, scorching heat, yet there was dignity. To carve Pharaoh's tomb or raise a temple to Amun was to leave a mark on eternity. Workers sang as they hauled their chants, keeping rhythm. Songs eased the burden, transforming back-breaking toil into communal effort. Seasonal labor work shifted with the Nile's rhythm. During floods, fields lay underwater, freeing farmers to serve as laborers on state projects. This system balanced survival. Pharaoh gained labor from monuments, peasants gained food rations during idle months. This cycle ensured that no hands were wasted, that even in times of flood, work sustained life. The dignity of work, though peasants bore heavy burdens. Egyptian culture honored labor. Tomb paintings often depicted workers proudly, plowing, weaving, or carving, showing that survival depended on their effort. Even pharaohs were praised not only for ruling but for overseeing Egypt's prosperity, which flowed from peasant hands. Work was seen as part of Mat, the divine order. To labor was to serve gods and Pharaoh, to sustain harmony. Laziness was frowned upon, but diligence brought respect and hope for blessings in the afterlife. Specialized trades beyond farming and construction. Egypt nurtured countless specialized trades. Fishermen supplied Nile's bounty. Fowlers caught birds with nets. Brewers made beer for daily nourishment. Barbers shaved heads to keep lice away. Perfumers blended oils to mask sweat. And embalmers preserved bodies for eternity. Each trade, no matter how humble, contributed to survival. Fishermen fed families. Brewers sustained workers. Embalmers comforted mourners. Egyptians recognized that all work, from highest to lowest, formed the fabric of society. The workers' life daily routines were exhausting but punctuated with small joys. Workers awoke at dawn, labored until dusk, and rested with bread and beer. Songs, laughter, and shared meals lightened hardship. Families offered support, children helped in small tasks, and neighbors cooperated in harvests. Though wages were meager, community bonds gave strength. In shared labor, peasants found companionship, proving that survival was collective, not solitary. Artisans in Pharaoh's service. Some craftsmen rose above ordinary labor by working directly for Pharaoh. At Deir el-Medina, artisans built tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their homes were better, their pay higher, their skills celebrated. They painted walls with vibrant scenes, carved statues with precision, and inscribed spells with devotion. Their work ensured Pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife, a sacred duty that brought both honor and pressure. For peasants, hearing of these artisans was inspiring. It showed that skill and dedication could elevate lives, even in a rigid society. Closing reflection. Egypt's survival was written in sweat and calloused hands. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers bore the weight of the desert, transforming earth stone, and water into civilization. Their toil built monuments that still stand, crafted objects still admired, and grew harvests that fed millions. Though history remembers pharaohs, it was workers who ensured Egypt endured for thousands of years. Work was not only necessity, was Egypt's heartbeat. The central role of women in the vast story of Egypt. Women stood quietly, yet powerfully at its heart. Pharaohs commanded armies and scribes wrote laws, but in homes, fields, and temples, women carried Egypt's survival. They were mothers, wives, laborers, and priestesses, keepers of daily life. While other ancient societies often limited women severely, Egypt gave them unusual freedoms. They could own land, run businesses, inherit wealth, and even divorce. Yet for most peasant women, life centered on household duties and ensuring families endured the desert's harshness. Mothers and guardians. Motherhood was sacred in Egypt. The goddess Isis, mother of Horus, embodied protection, love, and resilience. Every Egyptian mother was seen as an echo of Isis, defending her children from sickness, hunger, and harm. From dawn until dusk, women worked to sustain families, grinding grain into flour, baking bread, fetching water from the Nile, tending goats or chickens, and weaving linen for clothing. These daily tasks were exhausting, yet they were acts of devotion. Keeping households alive. Women in agriculture. Women often joined men in fields during harvests. They gleaned leftover grain, bundled stalks, and carried loads on their heads. During floods, they planted seedlings along riverbanks. Though their labor was less celebrated in art, it was essential. A woman's hands could mean the difference between famine and survival. Children learned by watching their mother's diligence, inheriting resilience through example. Faith and ritual. Women were central to Egyptian religion. Many served as priestesses of Hathor, Isis, or Nephthys. They led songs with sistrums, danced in rituals, and carried incense in processions. Their voices lifted prayers, their hands offered libations. Their presence embodied fertility and joy. Even in households, women maintained shrines, lighting lamps, offering food to ancestors, and whispering prayers for health. They kept faith alive in quiet corners, making the divine part of daily life. Marriage and family. Marriage in Egypt was practical yet affectionate. Couples often married young, forming households early. Women managed homes, balanced budgets of grain, and cared for extended kin. Marriages could end in divorce, with women retaining property rights. Such independence gave them strength rarely seen in the ancient world. For peasants, however, survival-bound families. Closely. Marriage was less about contracts and more about shared toil. Closing of Part 1. Women carried Egypt in their arms, on their backs, and in their prayers. Their work, though often unseen in monuments, was the foundation of survival. Without their care, resilience, and faith, Egypt's story could not have endured. Women and work beyond the home. Though most women tended households, many also worked outside. Some brewed beer for sale, ran market stalls, or wove linen for trade. Others became midwives, healers, or mourners hired to sing laments at funerals. In towns, women worked as innkeepers or servants in noble households. These roles, though humble, brought income and independence. Even small contributions strengthened family survival. Women of power. Not all women lived modest lives. Some rose to great heights. Queens like Nefertiti and Hatshepsut ruled alongside or even in place of kings. Their images carved in stone show them offering to gods, commanding armies, and wearing crowns. These women proved that in Egypt, female strength could shape history. Though peasants rarely saw such grandeur, they carried pride knowing their land honored women not only as mothers but as rulers. Love and affection. Ancient Egyptian poems celebrate love with tenderness. They describe women adorning themselves with flowers, walking gracefully by the Nile, their voices compared to music. Husbands praised wives for their loyalty and beauty. For peasants, love was lived in simpler forms, sharing bread, raising children, standing together through famine. Marriage was not only duty but also partnership, built on affection as much as survival. Death and mourning. Women played central roles in death rituals. They prepared the dead, lead laments, and performed the role of Isis and Nephthys, weeping for Osiris. Their cries were not only grief but sacred acts, believed to guide souls into eternity. For mothers, mourning children was especially heartbreaking, yet faith offered comfort. Children lost too soon were believed to live eternally in the field of reeds, free of suffering. The legacy of women. Though history often celebrates pharaohs and priests, The true backbone of Egypt was its women. They ground grain, bore children, offered prayers, healed the sick, and even ruled kingdoms. Their resilience was as enduring as the Nile. Every loaf of bread, every woven cloth, every prayer whispered at night bore their touch. Their legacy was not only in monuments, but in the survival of Egypt itself. Closing reflection: women in Egypt were not silent figures in the background. They were the heartbeat of households, the voices of faith, the hands that worked, and sometimes the crowns that ruled. Their survival ensured Egypt's survival. Their strength, though often unrecorded, shaped the desert kingdom as surely as the Nile shaped the land. Death in the desert life in Egypt was fragile. Sickness, famine, or accident could strike without warning. The desert reminded Egyptians daily of mortality. The endless sands symbolized both death and eternity. Yet death was not feared as an ending, but understood as transition. For peasants and pharaohs alike, survival extended beyond life. The afterlife was the true harvest, and burial rituals were the seeds sown for eternity. Beliefs about the afterlife: Egyptians believed in the field of reeds, a paradise mirroring life along the Nile. There, fields always bore grain, rivers always flowed, and families reunited. Work existed but without hardship, joy without sorrow. To reach this paradise, the soul Ka needed the body, preserved through burial. The Ba, another aspect of the soul, traveled by day and returned at night. Both required tombs, rituals, and offerings to sustain them. Peasant burials: most peasants could not afford grand tombs. They were buried in simple pits in the desert sand, wrapped in linen or mats. The hot, dry climate naturally preserved bodies, a humble form of mummification. Loved ones placed small offerings, bread, beer, or amulets to protect the journey. These modest graves carried as much love as royal tombs, proof that survival after death mattered to all. Tombs of the wealthy nobles and pharaohs built elaborate tombs of stone and mud. Mastabas rose in early dynasties, flat-roofed monuments filled with chapels and storerooms. Later, pyramids became eternal mountains of stone, symbols of Pharaoh's divine power. Walls were painted with daily life: farmers harvesting, families feasting, scenes meant to continue forever in the afterlife. Statues, furniture, and jewelry filled chambers, ensuring comfort for eternity. Rituals of burial: funeral rituals were elaborate. Priests recited prayers, women sang laments, and offerings were made. The opening of the mouth ceremony symbolically restored the senses of the dead, allowing them to eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. For peasants, rituals were simpler, but no less heartfelt. A prayer whispered, a loaf of bread left at the grave, a tear shed in faith, all ensured loved ones were not forgotten. Mummification: the wealthy preserved bodies through mummification. Organs were removed, dried, and placed in canopic jars. The body was dried with natron salts, then wrapped in linen. Amulets were tucked between layers, protecting the soul. This process reflected a deep truth: survival was not just of the living but of the dead. To decay was to risk losing eternity. To preserve was to ensure eternal life. The judgment of the dead in Egyptian belief: the journey after death was not simple. The soul traveled to the Hall of Mat, where it stood before Osiris, Lord of the afterlife. There, the heart was weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was light, free of sin, the soul passed into paradise. If heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by Ammit, the fearsome creature, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. This judgment gave moral weight to life. Even peasants believed their daily honesty, kindness, and fairness shaped eternity. Survival, therefore, was not only physical but ethical. Tomb offerings: tombs were stocked with food, tools, and furniture. Bread, beer, and dried meats were common offerings. Wooden models of servants or boats symbolically ensured eternal labor and transport. Even the poor offered what little they could: a loaf, a jug of water, a simple amulet. Love and remembrance mattered more than wealth. For Egyptians believed memory itself sustained the dead. Funerary texts, spells, and prayers guided the dead. The pyramid texts, carved for pharaohs, evolved into the coffin texts and later the Book of the Dead. These writings instructed souls through dangers of the underworld: serpents, lakes of fire, and hostile demons. Peasants rarely owned scrolls, but priests recited prayers, ensuring even the humble found guidance. Words themselves were seen as power, bridges between life and eternity. Mourning and memory mourning was communal. Women wailed as Isis and Nephthys had for Osiris, guiding souls with lament. Families returned yearly to graves with offerings, renewing bonds. Egyptians believed forgetting the dead was the greatest tragedy. Memory kept souls alive, ensuring they thrived in the field of reeds. Survival was thus both physical and spiritual, carried in love as much as in ritual. Eternity in stone. The great monuments of Egypt, pyramids, temples, tombs were not mere buildings, they were survival strategies, defying time itself. Pharaohs carved their names into stone, ensuring remembrance. Nobles decorated chapels with prayers, hoping voices would echo for millennia. Peasants, though without stone tombs, shared the same dream that their names, too, would be remembered by family and gods. Closing reflection. Death was not an ending in Egypt. It was a passage, guided by faith, secured by ritual, and sustained by memory. Egyptians survived famine, flood, and war, but their greatest victory was over death itself. Through mummification, prayers, and remembrance, they ensured eternity. The desert swallowed bodies, but faith carried souls. In this union of ritual and belief, Egypt's people found the strength to face mortality with courage and hope. The temple as the heart of Egypt. In every Egyptian city, the temple stood as the center of life. For peasants, fields fed families, but temples fed souls. Towering pylons, painted walls, and vast courtyards marked places where gods were believed to dwell. Temples were more than houses of worship. They were banks, schools, storehouses, and cultural centers. Grain was stored in their granaries, medicine prepared in their chambers, and festivals launched from their gates. For peasants, the temple's shadow was protection. The power of priests served as the gods' voices on earth. They bathed in holy waters, shaved their bodies to remain pure, and wore spotless linen. Their duties included waking statues of gods at dawn, clothing them, offering meals, and singing hymns. Though peasants rarely entered inner sanctuaries, they felt the priest's presence in blessings, processions, and guidance. Priests read omens, cured illness with sacred spells, and advised Pharaoh himself. Their power rivaled kings at times, for they commanded not only faith but wealth, gods in daily life. Egyptians worshipped countless gods, each tied to survival. Ra, the sun god, brought warmth and light. Osiris, lord of the afterlife, promised eternal fields. Isis offered protection and healing, while Hathor brought joy and fertility. For peasants, worship was personal. A simple prayer to Hathor before childbirth, an offering of bread to Osiris for a departed relative, or a whispered thanks to Hapi for the Nile's flood carried immense meaning. Offerings and rituals. Temples consumed vast offerings, cattle, bread, wine, incense. Priests presented them daily, feeding gods symbolically before redistributing food to temple staff and workers. For peasants, this redistribution was sometimes survival. Festivals and offerings brought food into hungry villages. Even the smallest offerings mattered. A peasant might leave a few onions, a clay figurine, or a handful of barley. Faith was measured not by wealth but by devotion. Sacred animals. Temples often kept sacred animals, cats of Baswatit, ibises of Thoth, bulls of Apis. These animals embodied divine presence. When they died, they were mummified and buried with ceremony. For peasants, seeing a sacred bull paraded through streets was awe. It was as though the god himself walked among them. Temples as centers of knowledge. Temples preserved Egypt's wisdom. Libraries of papyrus scrolls held medical texts, hymns, and astronomical records. Priests studied stars to mark calendars, predicting floods and guiding farmers. Though peasants could not read these texts, they felt their power. The calendar told them when to sow, when to harvest. Healing remedies spread from temple to village. Knowledge flowed outward, sustaining life. Festivals at the temples. Temples were stages for Egypt's greatest festivals. Statues of gods were carried on sacred barks, escorted by priests, musicians, and dancers. Crowds filled courtyards, singing hymns, clapping hands, and feasting. For peasants, festivals were chances to feel the gods' presence. Even the poorest could share in free bread and beer, their hunger eased by divine generosity. These moments reminded the Egyptians that joy was as holy as prayer. The Opet festival. Among the grandest was the Opet festival in Thebes. Each year, Amon's statue was carried from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by music and celebration. Priests, nobles, and commoners alike joined in the procession. Peasants may not have traveled to Thebes, but stories of its splendor reached every village. Knowing their god was honored on such a scale gave them pride and reassurance of protection. Temples as economic powers. Temples owned vast lands, herds of cattle, and fleets of boats. They employed scribes, craftsmen, and laborers, creating entire economies. For peasants, temples were both benefactors and burdens. They provided food in famine, but also demanded offerings and taxes. Still, their presence gave stability, ensuring faith and economy were intertwined. Temples and healing. Many temples functioned as healing centers. Sacred lakes provided holy water, priests recited spells, and pilgrims slept in courtyards hoping for divine dreams. A peasant with sickness might journey miles to a temple, seeking blessings. Even if cures failed, faith itself healed the spirit, giving strength to endure. The mystery of the inner sanctum. Peasants rarely saw the innermost temple chambers, where God's statues were kept. Only priests and pharaohs entered, performing daily rituals unseen by common eyes. Yet the mystery itself gave power. To know that gods dwelt in hidden chambers reassured Egyptians that divine presence was real, even if invisible. Closing reflection. Temples were Egypt's beating heart. They were not only homes of gods but centers of food, healing, knowledge, and community. For peasants, temples represented hope. Hope for rain, for health, for eternal life. Even if their lives were harsh, the towering walls and shining rituals reminded them they were never alone. Temples stood as bridges between heaven and earth, between the struggles of today and the promise of eternity. The Nile, as highway. The Nile was not only Egypt's lifeblood, it was its highway. Boats glided up and down the river, carrying grain, fish, pottery, and people. For peasants, the river was both workplace and road, connecting villages, cities, and distant lands. Fishermen cast nets at dawn, traders loaded jars of beer and oil, and ferrymen guided passengers across. Without the Nile, travel over desert sands would have been nearly impossible. Peasant traders, though large caravans carried luxury goods. Peasants also participated in small-scale trade. A farmer might row to a nearby market with baskets of onions, a potter with jars, or a fisherman with fresh catch. In return, they received salt, tools, or cloth. This barter system sustained villages. Even without wealth, peasants exchanged what they had, ensuring survival through cooperation. Markets and bazaars. Markets buzzed with life. Stalls displayed baskets of dates, jars of honey, and loaves of bread. Traders shouted prices, children tugged at parents, and musicians played flutes to draw crowds. For peasants, markets were more than trade. They were social gatherings. Families met neighbors, news spread, and laughter filled the air. Amid hardship, markets brought color and community. Long-distance trade beyond villages. Egypt reached outward. Caravans crossed deserts to Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, and cattle. Ships sailed to Lebanon for cedar, to Punt for incense and myrrh, and to the Mediterranean for copper and tin. Though peasants rarely saw these luxuries, they felt their effects. Gold-decorated temples, incense-filled festivals, and bronze tools reached villages. The world beyond Egypt shaped even the humblest homes. Travel by land. Travel overland was harder. Donkeys carried loads across dusty paths, their bells jingling. Caravans moved slowly, threatened by bandits or sandstorms. Yet land routes were essential for reaching mines, quarries, and remote settlements. For peasants conscripted as laborers, these journeys were grueling, yet they also opened eyes to Egypt's vastness, binding distant lands into one kingdom. Boats and shipbuilding. Egyptians were skilled shipbuilders. Reed boats carried fishermen, while wooden ships with sails crossed seas. Oarsmen rowed in rhythm, guided by captains skilled in stars and currents. Peasants who rowed grain boats played unsung roles in Egypt's survival. Every load carried north ensured cities thrived. Every return trip brought tools and goods back to villages. Risks of trade and travel. Trade brought wealth, but it was not without danger. Sandstorms could blind caravans, crocodiles could overturn boats, and bandits often attacked travelers. A lost shipment meant hunger in villages and shortages in temples. Yet Egyptians faced risks with courage. Traders carried amulets for protection, sailors prayed to Sobek, and caravans traveled in groups for safety. Trust in gods and community gave strength against danger. The social impact of trade connected villages to cities, peasants to nobles, Egypt to the world. A fisherman's catch might feed a temple feast. A potter's jar might hold grain for Pharaoh. A farmer's onions might travel farther than he ever dreamed. Through trade, peasants felt part of something larger. Their work sustained not only families but also cities and gods. This sense of connection gave pride amid toil. Cultural exchange. Along with goods came ideas. Foreigners brought new music, stories, and fashions. Egyptians adopted cedarwood for ships, lapis lazuli for jewelry, and new techniques for tools. Peasants rarely met foreigners directly, yet they wore beads from far lands, smelled incense from Punt, and tasted spices from Asia. The wider world entered even humble homes, carried by trade. Pilgrimages and travel for faith. Not all travel was for trade. Pilgrimages to temples were common. Families rowed boats to sacred sites, offering prayers, gifts, or sacrifices. For peasants, such journeys were spiritual renewal, strengthening faith in gods who sustained survival. These travels blended hardship with hope, proving that even simple journeys held deep meaning. Closing reflection. Trade and travel were Egypt's lifelines, weaving survival across villages, cities, and borders. The Nile's steady current carried grain, dreams, and prayers alike. For peasants, every jar sold, every net cast, every boat rowed connected them to the kingdom's pulse. Though they seldom touched foreign lands, their labor linked Egypt to the world. Egypt endured because its people were not isolated. They were bound by river, road, and trade, sustained by the belief that survival was not only local but universal. Living in a world of signs. For ancient Egyptians, the world was alive with meaning. Every shadow, sound, or dream could carry a message from the gods. Survival meant listening carefully, reading omens, and respecting unseen forces that shaped destiny. Peasants, unable to control floods or famine, found comfort in signs. A bird's flight, a cat's behavior, or a sudden dream could offer warnings or blessings. In these symbols, they found guidance when logic failed. The power of dreams. Dreams were sacred windows to the divine. Egyptians believed gods spoke through visions, offering advice, warnings, or cures. Temples even offered dream incubation. Pilgrims slept in sacred courtyards, hoping gods would appear in sleep. Priests interpreted visions, prescribing remedies or rituals. Dream books, copied by scribes, listed meanings. Dreaming of clear water equals good health. Dreaming of a crocodile equals danger ahead. Dreaming of bread equals abundance. For peasants, these interpretations were lifelines, offering certainty in uncertain times. Omens in daily life. Everyday life brimmed with omens. A sudden sneeze could delay travel. A snake crossing a path was warning of misfortune. A falcon overhead meant Horus was watching, bringing protection. Peasants carried amulets shaped like scarabs or the eye of Horus, believing these symbols warded off evil. Children wore charms on necklaces to guard against sickness. Faith in omens gave peasants a sense of control over chaos. Even if floods failed or harvests faltered, they believed protection could be found in signs. Superstitions and magic, or Heka, was woven into survival. Spells were carved on amulets, written on papyrus, or spoken in rituals. Mothers whispered charms over sick children. Farmers buried figurines in fields to ensure fertility. Sailors painted eyes on boats to see dangers ahead. Priests of magic blended medicine and incantations, curing illness with herbs and words. For peasants, such practices were everyday life, small acts of faith woven into survival. Animal messengers. Animals were also seen as omens. Cats signaled protection, snakes warned of danger, and ibis birds carried wisdom. Even beetles rolling dung balls symbolized rebirth, inspiring hope for renewal. To peasants, animals were not just creatures but divine messengers. Observing them was as important as plowing fields or baking bread. Protection against the unseen. Egyptians lived with constant awareness of invisible threats, spirits, curses, or wandering souls. To guard against them, peasants used charms, prayers, and rituals. A knife made of ivory, carved with protective symbols, was placed under children's beds. Amulets shaped like lions or crocodiles promised strength. Even simple gestures carried meaning. Spitting 3 times after a bad dream, tying knots in linen cords to trap evil, or burning incense to purify homes. These acts gave people confidence that unseen forces could be managed. The role of professional magicians. Beyond family rituals, there were professional magicians. Some were priests skilled in sacred words. Others were wandering wise men or women. They wrote spells on papyrus, carved figurines, or performed dramatic rituals. For peasants, hiring such magicians was expensive. But in desperate times, illness, famine, or infertility, they sacrificed what they could. Belief in magic was belief in hope. Superstitions in agriculture. Farmers relied heavily on omens when planting. The sight of certain birds, the feel of winds, or the shape of clouds were read as signs. Before harvest, farmers sometimes placed amulets among crops, asking gods to protect grain from pests or storms. These practices were more than superstition, they were psychological strength. They reassured farmers that survival was possible even when nature seemed unpredictable. Dreams of the afterlife. Some dreams carried visions of the dead. Egyptians believed ancestors could visit in sleep, offering advice or warnings. Families listened closely, honoring messages by leaving food at graves or lighting lamps. Such dreams brought comfort. They reminded peasants that loved ones were not lost, but still watching, still guiding survival from beyond. Closing reflection for Egyptians. The world was never silent or empty. It was alive with messages, dreams, and signs. Omens shaped choices, magic offered protection, and dreams connected mortals to gods. In these beliefs, peasants found resilience, even in famine or fear. They trusted that the universe whispered guidance. Survival was not only in their hands but also in the hands of unseen powers who walked beside them. The sound of life in ancient Egypt. Music was not entertainment alone, it was survival. Songs lifted spirits during harvest, lulled children to sleep, and honored gods in temples. For peasants, who lived under constant struggle, music was the soft thread that bound families, communities, and faith together. The desert winds howled, the Nile whispered, but it was human voices that turned daily life into rhythm. Work songs echoed in fields, lullabies carried through mud-brick homes, and chants rose in temples, reminding all that even hardship could be endured with melody. Instruments of the common folk. Though temples boasted grand orchestras, peasants made simpler instruments. Hollow reeds became flutes, stretched animal skin formed drums, and strings of gut were tied to wooden boughs to create lyres. A farmer resting after plowing might pluck a few notes. A shepherd on the edge of a field might whistle or beat a small drum. These simple sounds were reminders that art was not reserved for nobles, it lived in every village. Songs of labor. Peasants often sang as they worked. Rowers chanted in rhythm, farmers hummed as they sowed seeds, and women grinding grain used repetitive songs to ease the strain. These songs were practical, keeping time and reducing fatigue. But they were also spiritual. Lyrics often invoked gods, asking for strength, fertility, or safe harvests. Work became worship, and worship became song. Music. In rituals, every ritual involved music. Weddings were filled with drums and clapping. Funerals echoed with mournful flutes. Festivals brought dancing, lyres, and cymbals. Priests used chants to awaken statues of gods, believing music carried prayers directly to the divine. For peasants, joining these rituals, whether clapping hands or singing refrains, was a chance to feel united with gods and neighbors alike. Bath poetry as memory alongside music. Poetry shaped survival. Egyptians loved verses, simple couplets, or long hymns. Farmers recited lines, comparing the Nile to a mother. Women sang verses of love to their husbands, and children learned rhymes that passed down wisdom. Poetry preserved memory. Stories of ancestors, heroic deeds, or divine myths were told in rhythmic form, making them easy to recall. In a mostly oral culture, poetry was both education and entertainment. The healing power of music. Music was not only art, it was medicine. Egyptians believed certain rhythms could heal illness, calm spirits, and even ease childbirth. Priests chanted over the sick, using tones thought to align the soul with divine order. In villages, mothers sang to children with fever, farmers hummed to themselves when weary, and mourners sang laments that eased grief. Melody carried comfort when remedies failed. Poetry of love and longing. Love poems flourished in ancient Egypt. Even peasants recited verses of desire, longing, and joy. Songs spoke of beauty like the lotus flower, of lovers waiting by the Nile, of hearts aching during absence. These poems gave peasants a language for emotions too deep for daily speech. In a hard life of survival, poetry offered sweetness, reminding them of love's power, even in hunger or toil. Music for the afterlife. Egyptians believed music followed the soul beyond death. Tomb paintings show harps and flutes, promising the deceased joy in eternity. Funerals included songs that comforted the living and guided spirits safely. Peasants joined these songs with sincerity, knowing one day they too would rely on the music of others to guide Them. Community and connection. Music and poetry united people. Villagers danced together during harvest festivals, sang together at marriages, and wept together at funerals. These shared rhythms created bonds stronger than hunger or fear. A single song could transform strangers into companions, just as a single drumbeat could guide dozens of rowers in harmony. Closing reflection for peasants. Survival was not only bread and water, it was song and verse. Music gave rhythm to toil, poetry gave voice to emotion, and together they gave meaning to existence. The harsh desert life might strip away comfort, but melody and rhyme restored it. Egypt endured not only because of Nile and fields, but because its people carried music in their souls. The heart of peasant life. For all their struggles with hunger, labor, and survival, what truly sustained Egyptian peasants was family. In mud-brick homes clustered along the Nile, kinship formed the backbone of life. Parents, children, and extended relatives worked side by side, sharing burdens and joys. Family was not just companionship, was survival itself. Fields could not be plowed, harvests could not be gathered, and bread could not be baked without the helping hands of kin. Marriage as partnership. Marriage in peasant society was rarely about wealth or politics, it was about partnership. Husbands and wives worked together in fields, raised children, and managed households. Love poems reveal tenderness between spouses, showing that even in poverty, affection flourished. Wives baked bread, brewed beer, and managed domestic shrines. Husbands tilled soil, repaired tools, and traded at markets. Yet roles often overlapped. Both labored, both endured, both sustained the family unit. Children in peasant homes. Children were both joy and responsibility. They were cherished gifts from the gods, but also extra hands for labor. From a young age, children fetched water, herded goats, or helped grind grain. Despite hardship, childhood was not without play. Toys carved from wood, balls made of cloth, or simple games with pebbles filled afternoons. Songs, stories, and lessons in household tasks shaped their growth. Above all, children carried hope. They were the promise that families would endure despite famine, flood, or toil. Elders and ancestors. Elders held respect in villages. Their wisdom guided planting, rituals, and family disputes. Ancestors, too, remained part of the household through offerings at small shrines. Peasants believed the dead watched over them, blessing fields and protecting children. By honoring the past, families ensured strength in the present. The living and the dead were bound in a single chain of survival. Domestic shrines inside homes. Simple clay shrines honored gods and ancestors. Families offered bread, beer, or incense. These acts reminded them that divine blessing began at home, not only in temples. Even when temples were far away, peasants felt gods within their walls. A flicker of a lamp, a whispered prayer, or a shared meal before a shrine turned houses into sacred spaces. Festivals of family. While most days were spent laboring, festivals brought families together in joy. During harvest feasts or temple celebrations, kin shared food, danced, and sang. Even in hunger years, families saved special treats, dates, honey, or beer to mark sacred days. Festivals reminded peasants that family was more than work. It was laughter, story, and song shared around flickering lamps. Marriage ceremonies. Marriage itself was celebrated simply but meaningfully. Couples exchanged gifts, families feasted, and neighbors offered blessings. A bride might receive jewelry or household items. A groom might provide tools or livestock. No grand temples were required. Marriage was sacred in itself, blessed by gods through community. Witness. Family. In times of famine. When famine struck, families clung tighter. Parents sacrificed portions for children. Elders encouraged patience, and siblings worked together to find food. Stories tell of mothers weaving baskets for extra income, fathers fishing by night, and children gathering wild plants. Family bonds softened hunger's cruelty. Love itself became nourishment when bread was scarce. The ideal of Mat in families' Egyptian life was guided by Mat, the principle of balance and harmony. Families strove to live by this ideal, showing respect to parents, fairness to siblings, and kindness to neighbors. A household that honored Mat believed it would thrive, for harmony within mirrored harmony with the gods. Closing reflection. Family was the anchor of survival. Through work, worship, and love, families endured what individuals could not. In the bonds of kinship, peasants found strength greater than grain, resilience deeper than the Nile. Though history often praises pharaohs and temples, it was families quiet, humble, steadfast that truly sustained Egypt. The fragility of life for peasants in ancient Egypt was a daily battle against illness. The Nile brought fertility, but it also carried parasites. Mud brick homes protected families, but they trapped smoke and dust. Hunger weakened bodies, while hard labor strained muscles. Illness was everywhere: fevers, stomach sickness, infected wounds, blindness, and tooth decay. Yet Egyptians did not surrender to suffering. They fought back with a blend of medicine, prayer, and magic. Healers of the villages and cities, great physicians studied in temples, but in villages, healing was simpler and more intimate. Wise women, elders, and part-time healers prepared remedies from plants, honey, and minerals. Garlic was eaten for strength. Honey was smeared on wounds to prevent infection. Willow bark soothed pain. Even bread mold was applied to sores, a practice that, unknowingly, echoed modern antibiotics. Though their tools were humble, these healers saved countless lives. Priests, as priests held deep knowledge of medicine. Temple libraries preserved medical scrolls filled with remedies and incantations. Patients traveled long distances to sacred sites, hoping priests would cure them with divine words and healing hands. Some temples even functioned like hospitals. Patients bathed in sacred pools, offered prayers, and received treatments from trained priests. For peasants, these visits were costly but often seen as worth the sacrifice. The role of magic in healing. Egyptians believed sickness could come from evil spirits, curses, or angry gods. To fight these unseen forces, healing required not just herbs but also magic. Amulets shaped like the Eye of Horus were worn to protect health. Incantations were whispered over water, which was then drunk as medicine. Figurines of demons were broken to banish illness. For peasants, healing was not simply physical, it was spiritual. Relief came when herbs and prayers worked together, every day. Preventive practices. Peasants developed habits to guard against illness. They washed with Nile water, avoided spoiled foods, and used oils to keep skin supple under the desert sun. Women braided children's hair tightly to prevent lice. Farmers covered wounds quickly with honey or resin, though limited by knowledge. These practices showed remarkable awareness of health. They reflect the timeless human instinct to protect life against unseen threats. Common illnesses of the peasantry. Peasants faced a long list of ailments. Malaria and fevers struck during humid months. Worms and parasites infested those who drank unclean water. Malnutrition caused weakness, brittle bones, and swollen stomachs in children. Teeth suffered worst of all. Sand mixed into bread wore enamel down quickly, leaving abscesses and pain. Ancient skulls show peasants with mouths full of cavities and infections. Illness was constant, but so was resilience. Families cared for one another, sharing remedies and comfort through every struggle. Surgery and practical treatment, though limited. Egyptian medicine did include forms of surgery. Simple cuts were stitched with linen thread. Dislocated bones were set with wooden splints. Abscesses were lanced with bronze tools, and bandages soaked in honey were applied. Peasants rarely accessed such advanced care, but soldiers and workers sometimes benefited when injuries threatened the kingdom's projects. Knowledge trickled down, giving villagers hope through imitation of professional practices. Healing through dreams were considered channels of healing. If herbs failed, peasants turned to sleep, hoping gods would reveal cures. Some visited temples to dream cures into existence. Priests interpreted visions, prescribing prayers, charms, or new remedies. This fusion of sleep, faith, and medicine reflected a belief that body and spirit were inseparable. Illness and community. Illness was never born alone. Villagers cared for the sick, offering broth, grinding extra grain, or watching children. Funerals, though sorrowful, united communities in shared grief, even in sickness. Peasants discovered strength through solidarity. Survival was rarely individual, it was collective. Closing reflection. Peasants of ancient Egypt endured endless threats of sickness, yet they resisted despair. Herbs, honey, charms, and prayer formed their medicine. When remedies failed, love and community offered healing of another kind. Egypt survived because its people balanced body and spirit, knowledge and faith. In their struggle against illness, they revealed the timeless truth: healing is as much about care as it is about cure. The Nile as clock and calendar. For ancient Egyptians, the Nile was not only water, it was time itself. Its yearly cycle determined when to plant, when to harvest, and when to rest. Peasants measured life not by months but by the river's moods. The year was divided into 3 seasons: Akit, the inundation flooding Pare, the growing season Shemu, the harvesty season carried its own labors, dangers, and hopes. Survival meant moving in harmony with this rhythm. Akit, the inundation when the rains fell far to the south in Ethiopia. The Nile swelled and spilled into fields. Peasants watched anxiously. A good flood promised rich soil. A weak flood meant famine. A flood too strong destroyed homes. During inundation, fields disappeared underwater. Farmers set aside plows and turned to other tasks, repairing tools, weaving baskets, or working on temple projects for wages. Families prayed to Hapi, god of the Nile, offering bread and beer at shrines. Children played in the shallow waters, while elders watched the river like a living deity. Pare, the growing season as waters receded. Fields glistened with black silt. Farmers rushed to plant barley, wheat, lentils, and onions. Oxen pulled wooden plows, while families sowed seeds by hand. Every day mattered. Too late, and crops would not mature. Too early, and seedlings drowned in wet soil. Farmers read the land with wisdom inherited from ancestors. Songs filled the fields, mixing labor with rhythm. Families worked together, every hand busy, every heart hoping for abundance. Shemu, the harvest finally, golden fields waved in the sun. Sickles made of flint or bronze cut grain. Families bundled stalks, threshed kernels, and stored harvests in baskets and silos. This was both joy and exhaustion. Songs of thanks were sung, but fear lingered. Would there be enough to survive another year? Taxes were collected by officials, taking a share for pharaoh and temples. Peasants carried grain in heavy sacks, their sweat mingling with relief. That the rhythm of survival, these 3 seasons formed the heartbeat of Egypt. Work, rest, and ritual aligned with the Nile. Even when famine struck, peasants clung to this rhythm, believing balance would return. For them, survival was not random. It was a cycle of promise renewed each year when waters rose, retreated, and gave life again. Rituals of the seasons. Each season was marked with rituals. During inundation, peasants threw offerings into the river, pleading with Hapi for just enough water. During planting, families lit lamps and prayed for seeds to sprout. At harvest, feasts honored Renanutet, goddess of grain, thanking her for the bounty. These rituals gave spiritual order to the seasons. They reminded peasants that survival was not only toil but also divine partnership. Hardships between seasons, between floods and harvests, lay hungry months. Food stores dwindled, and families rationed carefully. Parents ate less so children could eat more. Fishermen risked crocodiles to bring protein to villages. Women searched for wild plants, grinding them into coarse meals. These lean times tested resilience, but the cycle continued, always pulling life forward. The role of children in the seasons. Children's lives followed the seasons too. In inundation, they helped herd animals to higher ground. During planting, they scattered seeds behind plows. At harvest, they carried baskets of grain. Childhood and labor blended seamlessly into the cycle of survival. Yet festivals and play also marked their year, giving joy amid duty. The rhythm of the Nile shaped even their games. The Nile as teacher to peasants. The Nile was not only a river but also a teacher. It taught patience during floods, diligence during planting, gratitude during harvest. Its rhythm mirrored the rhythm of life itself, birth, growth, and death. In every stage, peasants found meaning. The Nile whispered that survival was a journey of cycles, not a single struggle. Closing reflection. The Nile's seasons were Egypt's heartbeat. They brought hunger and abundance, fear and hope, despair and renewal. For peasants, survival meant surrendering to this rhythm, trusting that the river's return would always bring life again. Through their harmony with the Nile, peasants endured desert heat, famine years, and endless toil. Egypt lived because its people lived in step with the eternal flow of water and time. Living with death. For peasants in ancient Egypt, death was never far. Famine, sickness, accidents, and hard labor claimed lives quickly. Yet fear of death was balanced by faith. Egyptians believed death was not an ending but a doorway to eternity. This belief gave peasants strength. Even when bread was scarce or illness struck, they trusted the soul would journey beyond. Sustained by the gods, the journey of the soul. Egyptians imagined the soul traveling after death, facing trials before Osiris, Lord of the underworld. The heart was weighed against the feather of Mat, symbol of truth. If light, the soul entered paradise. If heavy with sin, it was devoured. For peasants, this story was both warning and comfort. Live justly, honor family, respect God's, and eternity would welcome you. Funerary practices of the poor grand tombs belonged to pharaohs and nobles, but even peasants honored their dead with care. Bodies were wrapped simply in mats or linen, buried with clay jars of food and amulets for protection. Families prayed at graves, leaving offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. Though humble, these acts expressed love and faith that ancestors lived on. Ancestors as guardians. Peasants believed ancestors guided the living. Spirits could bless crops, protect children, or warn through dreams. Families maintained small shrines in homes, whispering prayers or pouring water for the dead. Peasants. Death did not sever bonds, it deepened them. The dead remained part of the household, unseen but present. Faith as comfort when famine struck. Faith promised justice in the afterlife. When illness weakened bodies, prayers promised renewal beyond death. In a harsh world, eternity was the greatest hope. Peasants endured suffering with courage because they trusted it was not permanent. The afterlife would balance hardship with joy. The field of reeds. Egyptians dreamed of reaching the field of reeds, a paradise where the Nile flowed gently, crops grew endlessly, and families reunited. In this eternal land, peasants would farm without hunger, fish without danger, and feast without fear. For those who toiled in deserts and fields, this vision was profound. Paradise was not palaces or jewels, but an ideal version of the life they already knew, only free of hardship. Rituals for the afterlife. Even the poorest families performed rituals to aid the journey of loved ones. Simple prayers were recited. May your soul walk in sunlight. May your fields never fail. Some carved small figurines called ushabtis, believing these servants would work in the afterlife so the deceased could rest. Even a single clay figure was a treasure for peasants. The fear of oblivion. Despite faith, peasants feared being forgotten. To die without offerings, without family prayers, was to fade from eternity. This fear drove families to honor ancestors with devotion, ensuring names were spoken and souls remembered. In this way, memory itself became survival. To be remembered was to live forever. Death and community funerals were not private but communal. Villagers gathered to mourn, sing laments, and share bread. In grief, communities found unity. Death, though painful, reminded them of shared humanity and collective endurance. Through these rituals, peasants affirmed that life and death were not solitary journeys, they were shared experiences. Closing reflection. Faith in eternity was Egypt's greatest strength. It turned death into hope, sorrow into comfort, and despair into resilience. Peasants who faced famine, sickness, or toil found courage in the promise that beyond this life, justice and joy awaited. Egypt's greatness lay not only in pyramids and temples, but in the quiet faith of ordinary people who believed their souls were eternal. Unsung builders of civilization. When history remembers Egypt, it often speaks of pharaohs' temples and pyramids, yet beneath those towering monuments lived millions of peasants, the true foundation of the kingdom. Without their hands, there would have been no harvests to feed workers, no taxes to fund monuments, no rituals to sustain gods. Their lives were humble, their names mostly forgotten, yet their labor carved Egypt's greatness. Each plowed furrow, each baked loaf, each woven basket contributed to a civilization that still amazes the world. Strength and simplicity. Though poor in wealth, peasants were rich in resilience. They endured floods, famine, and disease, yet never ceased to plant, to pray, to sing. Their strength was not loud but steady, not celebrated but essential. Survival itself was their triumph. By living, loving, and working, they kept Egypt alive for thousands of years. The quiet culture of the villages hummed with simple culture, songs sung in fields, stories whispered to children, amulets carved from clay. These were not written in stone, but they were the heartbeat of Egypt. Temples may have displayed grandeur, but homes displayed endurance. The peasant's mud brick house was as important to Egypt's soul as the pharaoh's palace. Transmission of knowledge. Generations of peasants passed down practical wisdom: when to plant, how to mend nets, how to read omens in the sky. Fathers taught sons to plow, mothers taught daughters to weave and brew. This oral tradition preserved survival skills as surely as scribes preserved myths. The empire rested on knowledge not of books, but of hands and hearts, that the spiritual legacy, the faith of peasants, their prayers to Nile and gods, their offerings at humble shrines, their dreams of the field of reeds wove spirituality into daily life. They proved that devotion does not require wealth. Their spirituality was practical and personal, making survival itself an act of worship. Eternal presence. Though most peasants remain nameless, their spirit endures. Every monument still standing, every tomb still painted, every papyrus still read. These exist because peasants sustained the kingdom that created them. Their lives were not wasted. They echo in the stones, in the river's flow, in the very idea of Egypt. Closing reflection. The story of Egypt is the story of peasants resilient, faithful, enduring. They did not wear crowns or command armies, but they fed kings, built temples, and kept the rhythm of survival alive. Their legacy is not written in royal decrees, but in the eternal truth that civilizations are built not by the few at the top, but by the many who labor unseen. In their songs, their prayers, and their endless toil, the peasants of Egypt left behind the greatest gift, proof that strength is found in resilience, dignity in survival, and eternity in memory.